5 years of letters sent into the void. 5 years of silence that should have told her everything but didn't. Evelyn Hart stood by that fence post every sunset, clutching paper worn soft as prayer cloth, waiting for a dead man she didn't yet know was gone. The day the cattle drive rolled into Red Willow, Wyoming, everything she'd built on hope and memory would crumble only to make room for something real. This is a story about the difference between waiting and living. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind across the Wyoming plains had a voice all its own, low and mournful, like it carried the ghosts of everyone who'd ever crossed this territory and left pieces of themselves behind. Evelyn Hart had come to know that wind intimately over the past 5 years. The way you know a companion you never asked for but learned to tolerate. It whispered through the gaps in her schoolhouse walls during the day and rattled the shutters of her boarding house room at night, and every evening at sunset it tugged at her skirts as she stood by the fence post at the edge of town. The fence post had been there longer than Red Willow itself, a weathered cedar pillar that marked where civilization ended and the wild began. Someone had driven it deep into the earth decades ago with purpose, though that purpose had long since been forgotten. Now it served as Evelyn's anchor, the place where she came to watch the horizon and wait for something that never arrived. Still at it. Miss Hart. The voice belonged to George Brennan, owner of the dry goods store, who was locking up for the evening. His tone held that particular mixture of sympathy and exasperation that Evelyn had grown accustomed to from the townspeople of Red Willow. "Good evening, Mr. Brennan." She didn't turn around, keeping her eyes fixed on the distant point where the setting sun turned the prairie grass to copper. 5 years is a long time to wait for a letter, miss. 5 years and 3 months, she corrected quietly, and I'm not waiting for a letter, not anymore. That wasn't entirely true, but it was what she told people when they pressed. The truth was more complicated, wrapped up in promises made in candlelight and sealed with kisses that now felt like they'd happened to someone else entirely. Captain Miles Rowan of the Union Army had written to her from a dozen different posts during the war, each letter more passionate than the last, painting pictures of the life they'd built together out west when the fighting finally ended. He'd claimed land in Wyoming Territory, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. He'd described the mountains, the endless sky, the freedom of it all. He'd promised her a house with windows facing east so she could watch the sunrise. He'd promised her forever. The last letter had arrived in the winter of 1870. It was brief, written in obvious haste, telling her he'd found work at a silver mine near South Pass City, that the pay was good, that he'd have enough saved for their wedding by spring. "Wait for me, Evelyn," he'd written. "I'm building us a future." She'd waited. Spring came and went. Summer burned itself out on the prairie. Fall painted the cottonwoods gold and let the leaves fall like regrets. Winter froze the ground so hard it rang when you walked on it. And still no letter, no Miles. By the time spring returned, Evelyn had made a decision that shocked her family back in Boston. She would go to him. If the mountain wouldn't come to her, she would cross an entire country to reach the mountain. She'd used her small inheritance from her grandmother to book passage west, traveling by rail, as far as the tracks would take her then, by stage through country so vast and empty it made her feel like she was the last person on earth. Red Willow wasn't much a collection of rough buildings clustered around a main street that turned to soup when it rained and dust when it didn't. But it was the closest town to where Miles's letters had come from, and the postmaster had confirmed that yes, Captain Miles Rowan had collected mail here for several months. Then he'd stopped coming. No forwarding address, no explanation. That was 5 years ago. Evelyn had stayed because leaving felt like giving up, and giving up felt like betrayal. She'd found work at the schoolhouse Red Willow's first official teacher and rented a room above the boarding house. She'd made herself useful, made herself part of the fabric of the town, all while maintaining this evening ritual that marked her as slightly tragic, slightly mad, definitely lonely. The letter she carried wasn't one of Miles's. It was her own. The last one she'd sent to South Pass City returned unopened with "addressee unknown" stamped across the envelope. She carried it like a talisman, or maybe like evidence. Evidence of what she couldn't quite say. That she'd tried. That she'd loved. That she was the kind of fool who'd organize her entire life around promises made in wartime. Evelyn. This voice was different, softer, belonging to Martha Wells, who ran the boarding house and had become something like a friend in the way that Western women became friends through shared silence more than shared confidences. It's getting dark. Come in and have some supper. In a moment. That's what you said yesterday, and the day before. Martha came to stand beside her, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. She was a widow herself, though she'd at least had the closure of burying her husband. There's stew, fresh bread, and that cowboy is back, the one who helped fix the boarding house roof last month. He's asking after you. Which cowboy? The tall one, with the kind eyes. Evelyn almost smiled. In Red Willow, that description could fit half a dozen men, but she knew Martha meant Samuel Curtis, the ranch hand who'd been finding excuses to linger in town whenever his work brought him near. He was nice enough, steady, hard-working, the kind of man who'd make a sensible husband, the kind of man she should probably encourage. Tell him I'm indisposed. Evelyn. Please, Martha. The older woman sighed but didn't argue. She'd learned that much about Evelyn over the years. She could be moved by kindness, but not by pushing. Don't stay out too late. There's weather coming. Evelyn nodded, and Martha left her to her vigil. The sky was doing that thing it did on the high plains, turning colors that didn't seem quite real, like God was showing off. Bands of orange and pink and purple striped the western horizon, and the first stars were beginning to prick through the deepening blue overhead. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter and let herself remember. She'd met Miles at her cousin's wedding in Boston, back when the war was still fresh and soldiers in Union blue were everywhere. He'd been on leave recovering from a wound at Antietam, and he'd moved through the celebration with a barely concealed restlessness, like a wolf temporarily caged. She'd found him on the terrace, away from the music and laughter, staring out at the city lights. Planning your escape? She'd asked. He turned, and she'd been struck by his eyes, gray as gunmetal, sharp with intelligence. That obvious, only to someone looking for the same exit. That had made him smile, a real smile, not the polite grimace he'd been offering the other guests. They'd talked until dawn about everything and nothing. He'd told her about growing up on a farm in Pennsylvania, about joining the army because it felt like the only honorable choice about the Western territories he'd seen during his deployment, and how they'd gotten into his blood like a fever. She told him about feeling trapped in Boston society, about teaching at a girls' school, because it was one of the few respectable occupations available to her, about reading accounts of Western exploration and feeling a hunger for open spaces she couldn't name. By the time the wedding was over, they'd made each other promises. He'd court her properly. He'd finish his service. He'd claim land out west and build something worthy of her. She'd wait. She'd prepare. She'd be ready when he sent for her. And she had been ready. She was still ready. That was the hell of it. Miss Hart, the voice startled her out of her reverie. She turned to find a man she didn't recognize standing a respectful distance away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the practical clothing of someone who worked with cattle canvas trousers, a worn leather vest, a wide-brimmed hat pushed back to reveal a sun-weathered face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark brown, almost black in the fading light, and filled with something that looked like concern. "I'm sorry to disturb you, ma'am," he said, and his voice carried the slow drawl of Texas or maybe Oklahoma. "I've been told you're the school teacher here." "I am." She straightened, slipping automatically into the persona she wore during daylight hours, capable, professional, unshakable. "Can I help you?" "I hope so, ma'am. My name is Colton Hale. I'm scouting for a cattle drive that'll be passing near here in a few days, and we've got a situation that needs, well, someone with your particular skills." "My skills as a teacher." "Yes, ma'am. We've got a boy with us, orphan, we picked up about 100 miles back. His folks died of fever, and he's got no kin that we can find. We can't take him further north with us, and I was hoping you might know of a family here in Red Willow that could take him in." Evelyn's mind immediately began sorting through the families she knew. The Johnsons had 4 children already, but might be persuaded. The Hendersons had just lost their eldest son to influenza and might welcome another mouth to feed. The Cheneys were childless and had mentioned wanting to adopt. "How old is the boy?" 8, maybe 9, small for his age, quiet. The trail's been hard on him. "Where is he now?" "Back at our camp about 5 miles out." We're holding here for a few days to let the herd rest before we push on. I thought I'd ride in and, well, see if there was help to be had. There was something in the way he said it helped to be had that suggested this wasn't just about practical arrangements. This was about a man who'd taken responsibility for a child he didn't know and was determined to see it through properly. I'll need to meet him, Evelyn said. And I'll need to speak with the families I have in mind. It's not a decision to be made lightly. No, ma'am, it's not. He shifted his weight, and she noticed for the first time that he was favoring his left leg slightly. An old injury, probably. If you'd be willing to ride out tomorrow, I can introduce you. We've got decent accommodations, nothing fancy but clean and safe. I'll come in the morning, after breakfast. I'm grateful, Miss Hart. He started to turn away, then paused. If you don't mind my asking, you out here every evening? The question caught her off guard. Yes, most evenings. Waiting for someone she should have deflected, should have offered one of the polite evasions she'd perfected over the years. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. I'm not sure anymore. Colton Hale nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense to him. I've done my share of waiting, wore a path in more than one piece of ground, watching horizons. He touched the brim of his hat. Good evening, Miss Hart. I'll see you tomorrow. He walked away with that slight limp disappearing into the gathering darkness, and Evelyn stood by her fence post wondering why a stranger's understanding had shaken her more than 5 years of pity. The cattle drive arrived 2 days later, announced by a sound like distant thunder that grew steadily louder until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. Evelyn stood with most of Red Willow's population on the main street watching as several hundred head of longhorn cattle flowed past like a river of hide and horn, guided by men on horseback who moved with the casual confidence of people doing something they'd done 1,000 times before. The dust was tremendous. Martha had warned her to tie a handkerchief over her nose and mouth, and Evelyn was grateful for the advice. Through the brown haze, she could make out individual riders, weathered men who'd probably been in the saddle since before dawn, their faces massed against the dust, their bodies moving in rhythm with their horses. She was looking for Colton Hale, though she told herself it was only because of the boy. She'd visited their camp the previous morning as promised, and met Lucas Birch, a thin child with enormous dark eyes, and the kind of stillness that came from learning early that the world could be cruel. He'd said almost nothing during her visit, just watched her with an intensity that made her chest ache. He hasn't talked much since we found him, Colton had explained quietly out of the boy's earshot. Buried his parents himself, 8 years old, and he dug 2 graves in hard ground, marked them with creek stones, and then walked to the nearest town looking for work so he could eat. My God. Yeah. Colton had looked at Lucas with something fierce in his expression. We found him trying to trade his mother's wedding ring for a meal. Can you imagine having to make that choice? Evelyn had spent an hour with Lucas, not pushing him to speak, just sitting nearby while she sketched the landscape in the small journal she always carried. Eventually, the boy had edged closer, watching her pencil move across the paper. When she'd offered to teach him to draw, he'd nodded, the first real communication he'd made. I think the Cheneys would be good, she'd told Colton as she prepared to ride back to town. They're kind people, steady, they've wanted children for years. You'll make the introduction? Of course. Now watching the cattle pass, she wondered if they'd already moved Lucas into town or if he was still with the drive. She was scanning the riders when she spotted Colton near the back of the herd, mounted on a rangy bay horse, his attention focused on a group of steers that seemed inclined to break away from the main group. He handled his horse with easy skill, cutting off the potential stragglers with minimal fuss. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and he touched his hat brim in acknowledgement. She nodded back, and then the herd moved on, flowing like liquid beef toward the holding pens on the north side of town. That's the one Martha mentioned, said a voice beside her. Sarah Henderson, one of her students' mothers, had appeared at her elbow. The cowboy with the kind eyes. He's here about an orphan boy, Evelyn said firmly. I'm helping arrange a placement. Mm-hmm. And is that why your cheeks are pink? The dust. Sure, honey, the dust. Sarah patted her arm. You know there's no shame in noticing when a man is worth noticing. That captain of yours, well, 5 years is a long time to hold on to a ghost. Evelyn stiffened. Miles is not a ghost. Then where is he? It was the question everyone asked, the one Evelyn had no answer for. Where was he? Why hadn't he written? Why hadn't he come for her, or sent word, or given her any sign that the promises he'd made still meant something? I should get back to the schoolhouse, she said abruptly. I have lessons to prepare. She walked away before Sarah could respond, before the sympathy in the other woman's eyes could crack something open inside her that needed to stay closed. The meeting with the Cheneys went better than Evelyn had hoped. Robert and Ellen Cheney were in their late 30s, married 15 years without children, a source of quiet sorrow that Ellen had once confided to Evelyn during a chance encounter at the general store. They ran a small farm on the edge of town, raising chickens and maintaining a kitchen garden that was the envy of Red Willow. When Evelyn explained the situation, Ellen's eyes had filled with tears. A boy? An orphan boy who needs a home. His name is Lucas Birch. He's 8 or 9. His exact age isn't known. He's been through significant trauma, losing both parents recently. He'll need patience and understanding. We have both in abundance, Robert said quietly. His hand found his wife's, and the look they exchanged was full of a hope so naked it hurt to witness. When can we meet him? That was how Evelyn found herself riding out to the cattle drive's camp again the following day, this time with the Cheneys on their wagon. Colton met them at the edge of camp, and if he was surprised to see that she'd worked so quickly, he didn't show it. Mr. and Mrs. Cheney, this is Colton Hale, the trail scout I mentioned. Colton shook hands with both of them, his manner respectful, but assessing. He was evaluating them, Evelyn realized, making sure they were worthy of Lucas. The protectiveness in that observation made something warm unfurl in her chest. The boy's been helping our cook this morning, Colton said. Learning to make biscuits. He seems to like having tasks. They found Lucas exactly where Colton said he'd be, standing on a crate by the chuck wagon, carefully cutting lard into flour under the watchful eye of a grizzled man who looked like he'd been born wearing a bandana and an apron. The boy's face was smudged with flour, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and for the first time since Evelyn had met him, he looked like what he was, a child. Ellen Cheney made a small sound, half gasp, half sob, and Robert's arm went around her shoulders. Lucas, Colton called. Got some folks here who'd like to meet you. The boy looked up, his expression immediately shuddering. He climbed down from the crate and walked toward them with the wary approach of an animal that had learned not to trust. Evelyn knelt down so she was at his eye level. Lucas, do you remember me, Miss Hart, from the other day? A slight nod. These are Mr. and Mrs. Cheney. They live here in Red Willow, and they have a farm with chickens and a big garden. They've been hoping for a long time to have a son. She paused, choosing her words carefully. They're wondering if you might like to come live with them. Lucas looked at the Cheneys, then at Colton, then back at Evelyn. Forever. The single word nearly broke her. Yes, Lucas, forever. What if... His voice was so quiet they had to lean in to hear him. What if they changed their minds? Ellen Cheney moved forward and knelt beside Evelyn. We won't, she said, and her voice shook with the weight of her promise. I lost my own mother when I was about your age. I know what it's like to feel alone in the world. We want you, Lucas. Not as a favor, not as charity. We want you because we have love to give, and we've been waiting for the right person to give it to. Can I think about it? Lucas asked. Of course you can, Robert said. But while you're thinking, maybe you'd like to come see the farm. Meet our chickens. They're very friendly chickens. That earned the smallest suggestion of a smile. Friendly chickens. Very friendly. One of them likes to sit on my wife's shoulder while she works in the garden. That's weird. It is pretty weird, Robert agreed solemnly. But we like weird things. Makes life more interesting. They spent 2 hours at the Cheney farm. Lucas remained quiet, but Evelyn could see him observing everything: the tidy house, the well-tended garden, the chicken coop where a fat red hen did indeed hop onto Ellen's shoulder and sit there like a feathered brooch. Robert showed him the room that would be his if he decided to stay, a small space under the eaves with a window overlooking the prairie. It's not much, Robert said, but we could build some shelves for your things, and there's room for a desk if you'd like one for studying. Lucas touched the window frame with his fingertips. You can see forever from here. You can. I come up here sometimes when I need to think. It helps having that much sky to look at. When they returned to the camp, Lucas went directly to Colton and looked up at him. "You think I should—" Colton crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level. "I think they're good people who'll treat you right. I think they have room in their hearts and their home for you. But it's got to be your choice, Lucas. You're young, but you've already made hard decisions. You can make this one too. Will you come check on me? Make sure I'm okay." Something shifted in Colton's expression. Surprise, maybe, or tenderness. "We'll be moving north tomorrow. Probably won't be back this way for months, maybe longer." "Oh." Lucas's face fell. "But I tell you what, I'll write to you. And I'll make sure I pass through Red Willow when we come back south next year. How's that? You promise?" "I promise. Cowboys don't break promises to their friends." Lucas considered this, then nodded and turned to the Cheneys. "Okay, I'll try it." Ellen burst into tears and pulled the boy into a hug that he tolerated with visible confusion. Robert shook Colton's hand with the gravity of a man entering into a sacred contract. As they prepared to leave, Colton drew Evelyn aside. "That was good work, Miss Hart, finding them." "They found themselves," Evelyn said. "I just made the introduction." "You did more than that. You gave that boy hope. That's not a small thing." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something, then pulled an envelope from his vest pocket. "This is for you. Don't open it now. Wait until after we've left town, please." She took the envelope, feeling its weight, seeing her name written across the front in a strong, angular hand. "What is this? Information you deserve to have. I'm sorry it took me this long to give it to you." He touched his hat brim. "It's been an honor knowing you, Evelyn Hart. You're exactly the kind of person who makes the West a better place." Before she could respond, he'd swung up onto his horse and ridden away, leaving her standing with an envelope that suddenly felt heavy as lead in her hands. She waited until sunset, until she was standing by her fence post. The day's duties finished, the schoolhouse cleaned, and locked her supper eaten without tasting it. The cattle drive had moved out that morning, rolling north like a slow brown tide, taking Colton Hale and his secrets with them. The envelope felt heavier than it should as she turned it over in her hands, her name on the front, nothing else. She broke the seal with shaking fingers and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. The first was a letter in Colton's handwriting. "Miss Hart, I'm not good with words, not the way educated people are, but I'll do my best because you deserve the truth, and I'm the only one who can give it to you. 4 years ago, I was working at a silver mine near South Pass City. It was hard work, dangerous work, the kind of work men do when they're trying to build something for their future. There was another man working there, Captain Miles Rowan. We became friends the way men do in those situations, trusting each other with our lives every time we went underground. Miles talked about you constantly, showed me your photograph, read parts of your letters out loud when he'd had too much whiskey and was feeling homesick for something he couldn't quite name. He was saving every penny to bring you west, working double shifts, taking risks he shouldn't have taken. In March of 1871, there was a collapse. 3 men died, including Miles. I was there. I pulled his body out myself. Before he died, he made me promise something. He made me promise I'd find you if I ever could tell you what happened, tell you he was sorry he broke his promises. He said his last letter to you was a lie. He hadn't found good work at the mine. He'd gone there desperate, gambling everything on a strike that never came. He said he was too ashamed to write again until he had something to offer you besides failure. I know this is hard to read. I've carried this information for 4 years looking for you, not knowing where you'd gone. When I heard there was a school teacher in Red Willow who came from Boston and stood by a fence post every evening watching the horizon, I knew I'd found you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry it took so long for the truth to reach you. Miles Rowan was a good man who loved you very much. He deserves to be remembered for that love, not for the silence that followed it. If you want to know anything more, if you have questions or just need to rage at someone, I'll be coming back through Red Willow when we return south next spring. I'll answer anything you want to ask. With deepest respect, Colton Hale. The second sheet was an official document from the South Pass City Mining Office, a death certificate for Captain Miles Rowan dated March 15, 1871. There was also a small creased photograph that must have been Miles's. It showed a version of Evelyn from 6 years ago, younger and so full of hope it made her current self seem like a completely different person. She stood there as the sun set, as the light drained from the sky, as the first stars appeared like chips of ice in the darkening blue. The letter trembled in her hands. Dead. Miles was dead. Had been dead for 4 years while she stood by this fence post waiting for someone who would never come. The grief should have been overwhelming, should have dropped her to her knees. Instead, what she felt was a strange, terrible relief. He hadn't abandoned her, hadn't changed his mind, hadn't found someone else or decided she wasn't worth the trouble of sending for. He had loved her, he had worked for her. He had died still trying to build them a future. And she had wasted 4 years of grief on silence instead of mourning. The sound that came out of her was half laugh, half sob. She pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold it in, but it kept coming great shuddering gasps that shook her whole body. She sank down to sit on the ground, her back against the fence post, the letter clutched to her chest, and let herself finally grieve the man she'd loved and lost without ever knowing he was gone. "Evelyn?" Martha's voice concerned. The boarding house owner must have seen her from the window. "I'm all right," Evelyn managed. I need a moment." "Is that from the cowboy, the one who left this morning?" "Yes." Martha sat down beside her, not asking permission, just settling her weight onto the dusty ground with a grunt. "Bad news. The worst, and also the best, somehow." Evelyn handed her the letter with shaking hands. "He's dead. Miles is dead, has been dead for 4 years." Martha read in silence, and when she finished, she folded the letter carefully and handed it back. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Relief, grief, anger that no one told me sooner." Evelyn laughed wetly. "I've been waiting for a ghost, an actual ghost. You've been waiting for answers. Now you have them." "Now I have them," Evelyn repeated. She looked at the horizon where the last light was fading. The cattle drive was up there somewhere, moving north, taking Colton Hale further away with every passing hour. He carried this information for 4 years. Went looking for me. He could have just let it stay a mystery. Some men have a conscience that won't let them rest. He's coming back through in the spring. He said I could ask him questions. "Will you?" Evelyn didn't answer. She wasn't sure she knew. They sat together in the gathering dark, 2 women who understood loss while the wind whispered across the prairie, and the fence post stood silent witness to the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Inside her chest, something that had been pulled tight as a bowstring for 5 years finally went slack. The waiting was over. Miles Rowan was gone, really and truly gone, laid to rest in a grave she'd never seen, mourned 4 years too late. But she was still here. Still breathing, still alive in a way she hadn't let herself be since she'd arrived in Red Willow. The question now was what she was going to do about it. The days that followed the revelation fell into a pattern Evelyn hadn't expected. She woke each morning with the knowledge sitting heavy on her chest. Miles was dead. Had been dead, would always be dead, but instead of the crushing weight she'd anticipated, it felt more like she'd set down a burden. She'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it was like to walk without it. The townspeople noticed the change. How could they not? For 5 years, Evelyn Hart had been the tragic figure at the fence post, the loyal woman waiting for her absent soldier. Now she walked through Red Willow, with her head up, her eyes clear, and something in her bearing that suggested she'd made peace with whatever ghosts had been haunting her. "You seem different," Sarah Henderson observed one morning at the general store. She was examining bolts of fabric while her daughter, one of Evelyn's students, played with a set of wooden toys near the counter. Evelyn was sorting through her purchases, chalk slate pencils, a new primer for the younger children. "Lighter somehow, like you've been untethered." Sarah tilted her head, studying her. "Did you get word about your captain?" Word had gotten around, of course. In a town the size of Red Willow, secrets were currencies that passed from hand to hand until everyone had handled them. Someone had seen her crying by the fence post. Someone else had noticed she'd stopped her evening vigils. The rest had been speculation and gossip, but close enough to the truth to sting. "I got word," Evelyn confirmed quietly. "He died 4 years ago. Mining accident." "Oh, honey." Sarah's face crumpled with genuine sympathy. "That's awful. But also, at least you know now." At least you're not wondering anymore. Yes, at least there's that. What Evelyn didn't say was that knowing had cracked something open inside her. Something that had been sealed shut for so long she'd forgotten it was there. It wasn't just grief, though. There was grief deep and real for the young man who'd promised her the world and died trying to deliver it. It was also anger. Anger at Miles for being reckless, for taking shifts he shouldn't have taken, for gambling with his life when he'd promised that life to her. Anger at herself for waiting so long, for organizing her entire existence around someone else's plans. And underneath the anger, in a place she was almost afraid to examine, was something that felt dangerously like relief. She threw herself into work with renewed energy. The schoolhouse became her sanctuary, the children her purpose. She expanded the curriculum, adding lessons in natural history and basic mathematics for the older students. She started a lending library, soliciting book donations from families and organizing them on shelves she built herself. She even convinced the town council to allocate funds for a proper globe so she could show her students where they were in relation to the rest of the world. "You're nesting," Martha observed one evening at supper. They were eating in the boarding house dining room, one of the few times Evelyn allowed herself to be social. "Making roots. I've been here 5 years. I should have roots by now." "You've been here 5 years in body. Your spirit was always somewhere else." Martha buttered a roll with deliberate precision. "But lately you seem present, like you finally decided to show up to your own life." Evelyn considered this. "Maybe I have." "Does this have anything to do with that cowboy, the one who brought you the letter, Colton Hale?" "That's the one. Tall fellow, kind eyes. Martha's told me all about him. Apparently he fixed our roof better than Samuel Curtis ever did, and Samuel's supposed to be good with his hands. He was being helpful, that's all." "Hmm." Martha's expression suggested she wasn't fooled. "And when he comes back through in the spring, as he said he would, are you going to talk to him?" "I don't know." That was a lie. She knew. She'd thought about it every day since reading his letter, turning the words over in her mind like prayer beads. "I'll answer anything you want to ask." What did she want to ask? What Miles's last moments had been like? Whether he'd been in pain, whether he'd said anything else about her. Or did she want to ask about Colton himself? Why he'd spent 4 years looking for her? What kind of man carried a dead friend's promise that long? Winter settled over Wyoming with the inevitability of stone. The first snow came in mid-November, soft and almost apologetic, dusting the prairie like powdered sugar. By December, the storms rolled in with serious intent, dumping snow and drifts that buried fences and forced people to dig tunnels from their doors to their outbuildings. The schoolhouse was brutal to heat. Evelyn arrived an hour early each morning to stoke the stove-breaking ice in the water bucket to fill the kettle. Her students came bundled in so many layers they looked like small, mobile haystacks. She taught them with gloves on her breath visible in the cold air and sent them home early when the temperature dropped too low for safety. It was during one of these abbreviated school days, as she was banking the fire and preparing to lock up, that Lucas Birch appeared in the doorway. "Miss Hart." She turned surprised. The boy had been living with the Cheneys for 2 months now, and while he attended school regularly, he'd remained quiet, watchful, slow to trust. This was the first time he'd sought her out outside of class. "Lucas, is everything all right? Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She gestured to one of the student benches, and he climbed up, his feet dangling several inches above the floor. She sat beside him, waiting. "Mr. Colton said he'd write to me, but I haven't got any letters." Evelyn's chest tightened. "The winter makes mail delivery difficult. Sometimes letters take months to arrive, especially if the sender is moving around a lot. Cowboys on cattle drives don't stay in one place long enough to send mail regularly." "So he didn't forget about me." "I'm certain he didn't forget about you, Lucas." "How can you be certain?" It was a fair question asked with the blunt pragmatism of a child who'd learned the world didn't always keep its promises. Evelyn thought about how to answer about what she knew of Colton Hale from 2 brief meetings and 1 devastating letter. "Because he made you a promise, and everything I saw of him suggested he's the kind of man who keeps his promises. It might take time, but I believe he'll keep it." "Did someone make you a promise once? Someone who didn't keep it?" The question landed like a blow, all the more powerful for being delivered without malice. Lucas was simply asking, trying to understand the world through the lens of his limited experience. Yes, Evelyn said after a moment. Someone made me a promise. He meant to keep it, but he died before he could. That's not the same as breaking it. Is that why you used to stand by the fence? You were waiting for him. I was waiting for word of him. I didn't know he'd died. She met the boy's dark eyes. And then someone, Mr. Hale, actually traveled a long way to bring me the truth. Even though it was hard news to deliver, even though it would have been easier to say nothing at all. That's how I know he's the kind of man who keeps his promises. Lucas absorbed this, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mrs. Cheney says dwelling on the past is like trying to plow a field that's already been planted. She says you have to tend what's growing, not worry about what got buried. Evelyn smiled despite herself. Mrs. Cheney is a wise woman. She is. He swung his legs, a gesture so boyish it made her heart ache. I like living with them. Mr. Cheney is teaching me to care for the chickens, and Mrs. Cheney lets me help in the garden. They don't mind if I'm quiet. I'm glad, Lucas. They're lucky to have you. Miss Hart, do you think I could write to Mr. Colton even if I don't know where to send it? I think that's an excellent idea. In fact, why don't you write the letter and I'll help you address it? If he's working for a cattle company, we can send it to their headquarters. They'll forward it when they see him next. The boy's face brightened, not quite a smile, but close. Really? Really? Come back tomorrow after school and we'll compose it together. He slid off the bench and headed for the door, then paused. Miss Hart, I hope Mr. Colton comes back to see you too. I think you'd like having a friend. Then he was gone, leaving Evelyn alone in the cold schoolhouse with the echo of a child's innocent observation ringing in her ears. Christmas came quietly. The town gathered for a modest celebration at the church where Evelyn helped organize a pageant featuring her students. Lucas played a shepherd and didn't forget a single line which Ellen Cheney declared was nothing short of miraculous. There was mulled cider and gingerbread carols singing that was more enthusiastic than tuneful, and a general sense of community that made Evelyn feel for the first time since arriving in Red Willow like she genuinely belonged. Samuel Curtis cornered her after the service, offering to walk her back to the boarding house. He'd been persistent in his attentions despite her consistent politeness that never quite crossed into encouragement. Miss Hart, I was wondering if I might call on you this week. There's a barn dance at the Morrison place on Saturday, and I'd be honored if you'd accompany me. Evelyn looked at him. Really looked. He was handsome in a weathered, dependable way. Good with his hands, steady in his work, respectful in his manner. The kind of man who'd make a good husband, who'd provide stability and security. The kind of man she should probably say yes to. That's very kind of you, Samuel, but I'm afraid I'm not ready for that just yet. His face fell, but he recovered quickly. I understand. But when you are ready, if you ever are, I hope you'll consider me. I will. I promise. She meant it as kindness, but as she walked home through the snow-quiet streets, she wondered if she was being cruel instead, holding him at arm's length while she sorted through feelings she didn't entirely understand. Feelings that had nothing to do with Samuel Curtis and everything to do with a cowboy she'd met twice who'd given her the gift of truth wrapped in pain. January froze the world solid. February was worse with blizzards that howled for days and left drifts taller than houses. Evelyn taught by lamplight even at midday, the windows too encrusted with ice to let in much sun. She developed chilblains on her fingers and a persistent cough she couldn't quite shake. Martha forced her to drink endless cups of hot tea laced with honey and whiskey, insisting it was medicinal. You need to take better care of yourself, Martha scolded, tucking another quilt around Evelyn's shoulders as she sat by the boarding house fire. All this work at the schoolhouse, you're going to wear yourself down to nothing. I'm fine. You're stubborn is what you are. Stubborn and lonely, though you won't admit the second part. I'm not lonely. I have my students. I have friends. You have people who care about you. That's not the same as having someone. Someone who's yours in the way that matters. Evelyn pulled the quilt tighter. I had that once. It didn't end well. Because he died, not because he stopped loving you. There's a difference. Martha settled into the chair across from her, her knitting needles clicking out a steady rhythm. You're young, Evelyn. Too young to spend the rest of your life as Red Willow's tragic schoolmarm. Is that what I am? Tragic. You were. I'm not sure what you are now, searching maybe, but you won't find what you're looking for if you don't let yourself look. The words stayed with Evelyn long after Martha had gone to bed. Searching. Was that what she was doing? And if so, what was she searching for? March arrived like a promise, half-kept, still cold, still harsh, but with hints of warmth that suggested winter might eventually release its grip. The snow began to recede, revealing the prairie grass beneath brown and matted, but alive. Birds returned their calls, tentative at first, then increasingly bold. The schoolhouse became marginally less miserable to heat, and Evelyn found herself watching the southern horizon with an attention she tried to tell herself was casual interest and nothing more. The cattle drives would start moving north again soon. Colton had said he'd return in the spring. Spring was coming. The arithmetic was simple, even if the feelings behind it were anything but. "You're doing it again," Sarah Henderson observed one afternoon. They were in the general store, and Evelyn had been staring out the window at the road leading into town. Doing what? Watching, waiting, just like you used to do by the fence post, except now you're pretending you're not. "I'm not waiting for anyone." "Honey, I've known you 5 years. I've watched you wait for someone you'd never met and grieve for someone you barely knew. I'm watching you now, and whatever's in your eyes when you look at that road, it's different. It's real." Evelyn turned away from the window. "Even if I were waiting, which I'm not, it would be foolish. He's a cowboy. His life is on the trail. He could be anywhere. So was your captain once upon a time. At least this one had the decency to deliver bad news in person instead of leaving you to wonder." It was exactly the wrong thing to say and exactly the right thing. Because yes, that was it precisely. Colton Hale had done what Miles Rowan couldn't. He'd shown up. He'd told the truth. He'd given her closure when he could have simply ridden on and left her in her ignorance. That meant something. She wasn't sure what, but it meant something. April brought the first real warmth, and with it, the restlessness that Evelyn had been trying to suppress for months. She found herself walking out to the fence post again, not to wait, but simply to stand in the open air and feel the wind on her face. The post was still there, weathered a little more by the winter storms, but solid, enduring. She no longer brought Miles's letter with her. She'd put it away in a drawer along with the photograph and the death certificate, not forgotten, but no longer carried like a burden. The grief had gentled into something more manageable, a sorrow she could live with instead of one that threatened to consume her. What surprised her was how often her thoughts turned to Colton Hale. The way he'd sat with Lucas, treating the boy with a respect most adults didn't extend to children. The careful way he'd delivered news he knew would hurt. The promise he'd made to return even though he owed her nothing. She didn't know him, not really. 2 meetings and 1 letter didn't constitute knowledge. But she wanted to know him, and that wanting felt like waking up after a long sleep. "Miss Hart," she turned to see one of her older students, Thomas Brennan, running toward her with something clutched in his hand. "Miss Hart, this just came for you. Pa said to bring it right away since it's marked urgent." It was a letter, travel-stained and battered, addressed to her in care of the Red Willow School. The return address made her breath catch. Hale care of Western Cattle Company, Abilene, Kansas. Her hand shook as she broke the seal. "Miss Hart, I hope this letter finds you well and that the winter treated you kindly. We've been on the trail since early March, pushing a herd north from Texas. We'll be passing through Red Willow territory in approximately 3 weeks, and I wanted to give you advance notice in case you have questions you'd like answered. I also wanted to check on young Lucas. If you could include a note about how he's faring with the Cheney family, I'd be grateful. I think of him often and hope he's found the stability and care he deserves. I know my last communication brought you difficult news. I've thought about that conversation, such as it was, many times over the winter. I hope I didn't cause more pain than was necessary, though I know any amount of pain was too much. Truth is a hard gift sometimes, but it seemed like the only one I could give you. I'll understand if you'd rather not speak with me when we pass through. I'll understand if you've moved on with your life and have no interest in revisiting the past. But if you do want to talk, I'll be there. That's a promise I mean to keep. Respectfully yours, Colton Hale." Evelyn read the letter 3 times, standing by her fence post while the wind tugged at her skirts and the sun warmed her shoulders. 3 weeks. He'd be here in 3 weeks. The realization sent something electric through her chest, not quite excitement, not quite fear, but something in between. Anticipation, maybe. The feeling of standing on the edge of something and not quite knowing if the drop would kill you or teach you to fly. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, then headed back toward town. She had a letter to write to Lucas. He deserved to know his friend was coming back just as he'd promised. And she needed to figure out what questions she wanted to ask Colton Hale, assuming she had the courage to ask them at all. The 3 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Evelyn tried to maintain her usual routines, but everything felt charged with a nervous energy she couldn't quite dispel. She caught herself checking her appearance in the mirror more often than usual, worrying about whether her dresses were too plain, whether her hair was neat enough, whether she looked like the kind of woman a cowboy might find worth talking to. "You're being ridiculous," she told her reflection one morning. "He's just coming to check on Lucas. That's all." Her reflection looked skeptical. Lucas, for his part, was beside himself with excitement. When Evelyn had shown him Colton's letter, the boy had actually smiled a full, genuine smile that transformed his serious little face into something that looked his age for once. He remembered. "He's really coming back." "He is. He said he'd write to you, and he did. He said he'd come back, and he is. That's what men of character do, Lucas. They keep their word. Will you be there when he comes? I want him to see how good I've been doing." "Of course I'll be there." The Cheneys were equally pleased. Ellen had baked Colton's favorite cookies based on a description Lucas had provided, and Robert had been practicing what he'd say to properly thank the man who'd delivered his son to him. "We owe him everything," Robert said when Evelyn stopped by to deliver Lucas's letter for Colton. "That boy, he's brought such joy into our lives. We'd given up hoping for children, and then this cowboy appears with a child who needed us as much as we needed him. It's a miracle is what it is. Mr. Hale will be glad to know Lucas is happy." "And what about you, Miss Hart?" Ellen asked gently. "Are you looking forward to seeing Mr. Hale again?" Evelyn considered lying, then decided against it. "I am, though I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because he gave you what no one else could, the truth about your captain. That's no small gift. Or maybe," Robert added with a knowing look at his wife, "it's because he seems like a decent man and you're finally ready to notice such things again." Evelyn felt her cheeks warm. "It's not like that." "Isn't it?" Ellen smiled. "Either way, we're glad you'll be there to greet him. He should know the good he did bringing Lucas to us and bringing you peace. Those aren't small things." The cattle drive was spotted 2 days earlier than expected. Word spread through Red Willow like wildfire, hundreds of head coming up from the south, probably the same outfit as last year. The town prepared for the influx of business, the saloon stocking extra whiskey, the general store laying in supplies the drovers might need. Evelyn told herself she wasn't watching for the drive. She told herself the fact that she'd chosen to wear her best dress, the deep blue one, with the ivory lace collar that Miles had once said brought out her eyes was coincidental. She told herself the butterflies in her stomach were anxiety about what questions to ask regarding Miles's death, and nothing more. She was a terrible liar, even to herself. The drive came in just after noon, announced by the now familiar rumble of thousands of hooves and the dust cloud that preceded them like a herald. This time, Evelyn didn't stand with the townspeople on the main street. Instead, she found herself drawn to the fence post, the place where this all began and ended, and perhaps was beginning again. She stood with her hand on the weathered wood, watching the horizon, and when a rider separated from the main drive and headed in her direction, she knew without seeing his face that it was Colton. He approached at an easy lope, sitting his horse like he'd been born in the saddle. As he drew closer, she could make out details, the same worn leather vest, the same wide-brimmed hat, the same dark eyes that held more kindness than any eyes probably should. He was dusty from the trail and clearly tired, but he sat tall, and when he saw her standing by the fence post, something in his expression softened. He dismounted while still several yards away, approaching on foot, with his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that made her throat tight. "Miss Hart." "Mr. Hale." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "You're early. Your letter said 3 weeks. Good weather pushed us along faster than anticipated. I hope that's not an inconvenience." No, it's fine." She gestured at the fence post. "I got your letter. Lucas got your letter. The whole town knows you're coming, I think. He smiled at that, a slow expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. That boy been doing all right. Your note said the Cheneys were working out, but I wanted to hear it directly. He's thriving, happy. They love him like he's their own blood, and he's starting to believe he belongs there. You did a good thing bringing him here. You did the good thing finding him the right family. I just had the sense to ask for help. He shifted his weight, and she noticed again that slight favor of his left leg, an old wound that probably ached after long days in the saddle. I've been thinking about you all winter, hoping I didn't make things harder with that letter. You made things clear. That's not the same as harder. No, I suppose it's not. He met her eyes directly, and she saw something in them she couldn't quite name, concern, maybe, or curiosity, or something warmer that she wasn't ready to acknowledge. I know I said you could ask questions. If you still want to, I'm here to answer, but if you'd rather just let it rest, I'd understand that too. Evelyn thought about all the questions she'd planned to ask, about Miles's last words, his last moments, whether he'd been afraid or in pain. She'd rehearsed them in her mind for weeks, prepared herself for the answers. But standing here now with Colton Hale watching her with those steady, kind eyes, she realized she didn't want to talk about Miles at all. I do have a question, she said slowly, but it's not about Captain Rowan. His eyebrows rose slightly. All right. Why did you spend 4 years looking for me? You said in your letter you were looking, but you didn't say why. You didn't owe me anything. You didn't owe Miles anything beyond basic decency. So why go to such trouble? Colton was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like he was choosing each word with precision. Because Miles died with my name on his lips, and your picture in his pocket. Because his last words were about promises he'd broken and the woman he'd failed. Because I held a dying man and promised I'd tell his story to someone who deserved to hear it, and then I spent 4 years trying to figure out how to keep that promise. He paused. And maybe because I wanted to meet the kind of woman who'd inspire that much devotion. Wanted to see if she was real, or just a ghost, a dying man conjured to make his ending easier. And her heart was beating too fast. Am I real or a ghost? You're real, Evelyn Hart. More real than I expected. Standing by this fence post for 5 years waiting for someone who never came, that's not ghostly. That's faith. Maybe foolish faith, but faith nonetheless. His lips quirked in something like a smile. Though I'm glad you stopped standing here every evening. Martha at the boarding house was worried you'd freeze to death last winter. You've been talking to Martha. I wrote to her in February, asked how you were doing, whether you'd gotten through the worst of grieving. She wrote back and told me you'd stopped haunting the fence post, started teaching like your life depended on it, and generally seemed like someone who'd decided to live instead of just survive. He took a step closer. I was glad to hear it. You deserve to live, Miss Hart. Evelyn, she corrected. If we're going to have this conversation, you should probably call me Evelyn. Evelyn. He said her name like he was tasting it, testing its weight. Then you should call me Colton. Mr. Hale makes me sound like my father, and he was a considerably better man than I'll ever manage to be. She found herself smiling despite the nervous flutter in her chest. I doubt that's true. You didn't know my father. They stood there in the spring sunshine, a careful distance apart, and Evelyn felt something shift in the air between them, some barrier coming down, some possibility opening up. It felt dangerous and exciting in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and considering whether to jump. Lucas wants to see you, she said, because it felt safer than examining whatever was happening. The Cheneys have invited you to supper tonight if you're free. They want to thank you properly. I'd be honored. He settled his hat back on his head, the gesture somehow marking a return to formality. What time should I present myself? 6 o'clock. Their farm is just past the church, can't miss it. There'll be chickens. Chickens? Very friendly chickens, according to Lucas. One sits on Mrs. Cheney's shoulder. Colton laughed a real laugh, warm and genuine. Well, I wouldn't want to miss that. 6 o'clock then. He started to turn toward his horse, then stopped. Evelyn, would you? That is, if you're going to be there anyway. Would you sit with me? At supper, I'd like to hear more about what you've been doing this winter, teaching and such. It was such a simple request delivered with an endearing awkwardness that suggested he wasn't quite sure of his welcome. Evelyn felt her smile widen. "I'd like that, Colton. I'd like that very much." He nodded, clearly pleased, and swung back onto his horse with an easy grace that made it look effortless. 6 o'clock, he repeated, touching his hat brim. "I'll be there." Then he was riding away back toward the cattle drive and his responsibilities, and Evelyn stood by her fence post, feeling like she'd just stepped through a door she hadn't realized was open. Martha was going to be insufferable about this, but as Evelyn turned toward town, already planning what she'd wear to supper, she found she didn't mind nearly as much as she should have. The afternoon stretched out with a peculiar elasticity that made Evelyn acutely aware of every passing minute. She returned to the boarding house to find Martha waiting with a knowing expression that would have been irritating if it weren't so accurate. "He's back then." The cattle drive arrived, yes. Evelyn moved past her toward the stairs, hoping to reach her room before the interrogation began in earnest. And the Cheneys have invited him to supper tonight, to thank him for bringing Lucas to them." "Just the Cheneys?" Evelyn paused with her hand on the banister. "I'll be there as well. Lucas wants us both present." "I'm sure Lucas does." Martha's tone was dry as dust. "That boy's got a better sense of what's good for you than you do yourself." "It's just supper, Martha." "Honey, nothing's ever just supper when you change your dress 3 times and pin your hair up like you're going to a church social." Evelyn felt her cheeks warm. "I haven't changed my dress 3 times." "Not yet. But you will." Martha came to stand at the foot of the stairs, her expression softening into something more maternal. "Listen to me. That cowboy rode all the way back here because he made you a promise. He could have sent another letter, could have had someone else deliver his regards to Lucas, but he came himself. Men don't do that unless they've got a reason. His reason is keeping his word. He's honorable. He's interested. There's a difference between honorable and attentive, and that man is both." Martha reached out and squeezed Evelyn's hand. "I'm not saying you need to fall at his feet. I'm just saying maybe you could stop pretending you don't want to." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. What was the point of denial when Martha could read her like a primer? Instead, she squeezed back and headed upstairs to do exactly what Martha had predicted, change her dress multiple times, until she found the right balance between trying too hard and not trying at all. She settled on a dress the color of spring grass, simple, but well made, with small pearl buttons up the front and lace at the cuffs. It was one she'd made herself over the winter, cutting and stitching by lamplight when sleep wouldn't come. She'd told herself she was making it because she needed a new dress, not because she was imagining someone seeing her in it. Another lie she'd been telling herself all season. Her hair cooperated for once, pinning up in a style that was neat without being severe. A touch of rose oil at her wrists and throat, a luxury she rarely indulged in. A final check in the mirror showed a woman who looked hopeful, and that realization made her pause. When had she stopped looking haunted and started looking hopeful? Sometime between reading Colton's letter in winter and standing by the fence post this afternoon, grief had transformed into something else. Not forgotten, but integrated. A scar instead of an open wound. The walk to the Cheney farm took 20 minutes, and Evelyn used every one of them to calm her racing thoughts. This was supper, with friends, nothing more. A chance to see Lucas thriving in his new home and to allow Colton to witness the good that had come from his intervention. It didn't need to be complicated. Except it already was complicated. Had been complicated since the moment she'd read his first letter and felt the careful compassion in every word. The Cheney farmhouse glowed with lamplight as she approached, and she could hear voices from inside Lucas's high, and excited Ellen's warm with laughter, Robert's steady bass providing counterpoint. And underneath it all, that distinctive drawl she'd only heard twice before, but somehow recognized instantly. Ellen opened the door at her knock, her face flushed from the heat of the kitchen and bright with happiness. "Evelyn, come in, come in. We're just putting the finishing touches on supper. Lucas has been beside himself all afternoon." The interior of the farmhouse was modest but welcoming, everything in its place, and shining with the kind of care that spoke of pride in one's home. The main room served as both kitchen and dining area, with a long table that had been set with the Cheneys' best dishes. Lucas was at the table arranging silverware with intense concentration, while Robert and Colton stood near the fireplace engaged in conversation. Colton looked different, cleaned up. He'd shaved, revealing a strong jaw with a small scar near his chin. His hair was still damp from washing, curling slightly at his collar. He'd changed into a clean shirt and vest, looking more like a ranch foreman than a trail-dusty cowboy. When he saw her, his face lit up in a way that made her stomach flutter. "Miss Hart Evelyn," he corrected himself with a slight smile. "You look lovely." "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." "Amazing what soap and water can accomplish." He gestured to his leg. "Though I'll admit the walk over here reminded me why I prefer horses. This old injury doesn't take kindly to extended ambulation." "What happened, if you don't mind my asking?" "Bull got ornery during a drive 3 years back. Threw me into a fence post hard enough to snap the bone. It healed crooked, which the doctor said was my own fault for not resting long enough." He shrugged. "Cowboys aren't known for their patience with sitting still." "Mr. Colton." Lucas abandoned his silverware arrangement and rushed over, practically vibrating with excitement. "You came. You really came." Colton dropped into a crouch, so he was eye level with the boy, his movements careful around his bad leg. "I said I would, didn't I? Cowboys keep their promises." "I got your letter, and I wrote back, but I didn't know where to send it, so Miss Hart helped me send it to Kansas, and I don't know if you got it, but easy, partner. One thing at a time." Colton's hand settled on Lucas's shoulder, grounding him. "I did get your letter. It caught up with me in Abilene about a month ago. Sounded like you've been doing real well here. I have Mr. and Mrs. Cheney are teaching me everything how to care for chickens and plant gardens and read better, and Mrs. Cheney says I'm a natural in the kitchen, and Mr. Cheney says I've got good hands for carpentry. And—" He paused for breath, his eyes shining. "I'm happy here. Really happy." Something in Colton's expression shifted, a tightness around his eyes easing. "That's good, Lucas. That's real good. That's all I wanted for you." "Oh, is it true you're going to stay for a while?" Mrs. Cheney said the drive needs to rest the herd for a few days. "That's the plan. Our trail boss wants to make sure we haven't pushed them too hard before the final stretch north." "So you can come visit again? Maybe see the chickens?" "There's one named Gertrude who really does sit on Mrs. Cheney's shoulder. I wasn't making that up. I wouldn't miss it for the world." Ellen called them to the table, and the next hour passed in a warm blur of good food and better company. She'd outdone herself with the meal: roasted chicken with herbs from her garden potatoes creamed with butter, fresh bread still warm from the oven, early greens from the cold frame dressed with vinegar. For dessert, there was apple pie made from fruit she'd preserved last fall, served with cream so thick it had to be spooned. The conversation flowed easily. Robert asking Colton about the trail, Ellen wanting to know about the country he'd passed through, Lucas peppering him with questions about the cattle and horses. Evelyn found herself content to mostly listen, watching the way Colton engaged with each person, respectful with Robert, charming with Ellen, patient and kind with Lucas. He had the gift of making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. "And what about you, Miss Hart?" Robert asked during a lull in the conversation. "How are your students faring this spring?" "Well, for the most part. We lost 2 families over the winter. The Simmons moved back east, and the Pratts relocated to Denver. But we gained the Morrison children, so our numbers are holding steady at 18. 18 students for 1 teacher," Colton shook his head. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary. Red Willow doesn't have the population to support multiple teachers, so I make do." She smiled. "Besides, I enjoy the challenge. Every child learns differently, and figuring out how to reach each one keeps things interesting." "Lucas says you're teaching them drawing now." "Basic sketching, yes. I find it helps with observation skills, and it gives the children a different way to express themselves." She glanced at Lucas. "Some of them have quite a talent for it." The boy ducked his head, pleased and embarrassed. "Miss Hart says I'm good at horses. I've been drawing the ones from your drive, Mr. Colton. Want to see—" He produced a small stack of papers from a drawer, and Evelyn felt a swell of pride as Colton examined them. Lucas had been practicing diligently, and it showed. His horses had life and movement now, no longer the stiff stick figures he'd started with. "These are remarkable, Lucas." Colton looked up, his expression serious. "You've got a real eye for detail. Look at how you caught the way this one holds his head. That's Spirit My Bay. You got his personality exactly right. You named your horse Spirit. Seemed fitting. He's got more spirit than sense sometimes, but He's loyal. Colton handed the drawings back carefully. You keep practicing this. Art's a valuable skill and not just for pretty pictures. Maps, brands, documentation, all of that requires someone who can draw accurately. You really think so? I know so. Why do you think trail bosses pay good money for men who can sketch terrain and water sources? Because pretty words don't tell you where the river bends or where the canyon narrows. Pictures do. He tapped the drawings. You keep at this, you could make yourself valuable to a lot of operations. Lucas's entire face transformed with pride and possibility. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, watching it. This was what the boy had needed, not just love and stability, though those were crucial, but someone who saw his potential and spoke to it directly man to man rather than adult to child. After supper, they moved outside to enjoy the mild evening. Ellen had been right about Gertrude. The fat red hen immediately flew up to perch on her shoulder, settling there like she owned the place. Lucas gave them the full tour, showing off the expanded chicken coop Robert had built, the neat rows of the kitchen garden, just beginning to sprout the small workshop where Robert was teaching him basic carpentry. He's a natural, Robert said quietly to Evelyn and Colton as Lucas ran ahead to show them where they were planning to build a larger barn. Good hands, patient, willing to learn. If he keeps on like this, he'll be able to help me expand the farm operation in a few years. He talks about you both like you hung the moon, Colton said. Whatever you're doing, it's working. We're loving him, Ellen said simply. That's all. Sometimes that's enough. Eventually, the evening drew to a close. Lucas hugged Colton with the fierce intensity of a child who'd learned that people could disappear without warning, and Colton hugged back just as fiercely, murmuring something in the boy's ear that made him nod solemnly. I'll come see you again before we leave, Colton promised. And I'll write when I can. It might take a while for letters to catch up, but they'll come. I'll write back, Lucas said. Miss Hart says I'm getting better at my penmanship. I don't doubt it. You're getting better at everything. Ellen packed up a basket of leftovers for Colton to take back to camp, and after another round of thanks and goodbyes, Evelyn found herself walking back toward town with Colton falling into step beside her. The sun had set while they were inside, and the prairie sky was doing its spectacular twilight show streaks of orange and pink, fading into deep purple stars beginning to emerge like pinpricks in dark velvet. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their footsteps crunching on the dirt road. Evelyn was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the way his longer stride had adjusted to match hers, how he'd positioned himself on the side closer to the road, as if he might need to shield her from passing wagons, even though none were likely at this hour. That was a good evening, Colton said finally. Thank you for including me. You're the one they wanted to thank. I was just there for moral support. I doubt that. Lucas lights up when you're around. The Cheneys trust your judgment. You're more than moral support, you're part of their family. The observation pleased her more than it should have. They're good people. I'm glad to be counted among their friends. They're not the only ones glad for it. Evelyn glanced at him, but his face was shadowed in the gathering dark. Meaning, I'm glad I got to see you again. Glad you let me see you after everything. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I worried all winter that I'd done the wrong thing delivering that news the way I did. That maybe ignorance would have been kinder. No. Truth is always better, even when it hurts. She pulled her shawl tighter against the evening chill. You gave me closure, Colton. That's a gift, not a burden. You seem different than when I met you last year. Lighter, somehow. I feel different. For 5 years I was waiting for something that had already happened. Now I know the truth, and I can move forward, I suppose. Whatever that means. What do you want it to mean? The question caught her off guard. What did she want? For so long, her wants had been defined by someone else's promises Miles would come for her. Miles would build them a life. Miles would make her dreams of the West come true. But Miles was gone, and she was still here, and her life had continued in ways she never planned for. I'm not sure yet, she admitted. I love teaching. I love Red Willow despite its rough edges. I've built something here small, maybe, but mine. I'm not the woman who came west chasing a ghost anymore. No, you're not. You're the woman who stayed and made a life anyway. That takes courage. They'd reached the edge of town where the boarding house stood with its welcoming lights. Evelyn stopped, not quite ready for the evening to end. The drive leaves in a few days? 3 days, most likely. Trail boss wants to make sure the herd's rested and there's some gear that needs repair. He shifted his weight off his bad leg. I was hoping I might see you again before we go. If you're willing. I'd like that. The words came easier than she expected. Perhaps you could come by the schoolhouse. The children would enjoy meeting a real cowboy, and I'm sure they'd have questions about the trail. His smile was visible even in the dim light. I'm not sure I qualify as a real cowboy in the romantic sense, but I'd be happy to talk to your students. What time? 2 o'clock tomorrow. That's when I usually do history and geography, and you'd be a much more interesting lesson than anything I could pull from a textbook. 2 o'clock it is. He tipped his hat. Thank you for tonight, Evelyn, for everything. Thank you for coming back, for keeping your promise to Lucas. She paused, then added more quietly, and to me. Something passed between them in that moment, some unspoken understanding that felt weighted with possibility. Then Colton was mounting his horse. He'd left it tied at the boarding house hitching post and riding off toward the camp, and Evelyn was standing alone in the gathering dark, feeling like she'd just glimpsed something she didn't yet have words for. Martha, of course, was waiting in the parlor with her knitting. Well, what? Don't play coy with me, girl. How was supper? Evelyn sank into the chair opposite her, suddenly exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. It was lovely. The Cheneys were warm and welcoming. Lucas was thrilled, Colton was charming and kind, and I invited him to speak to my students tomorrow. So you're seeing him again? For educational purposes? Educational. Martha's needles clicked steadily. And after he talks to the students? What then? Then he leaves with the drive, I suppose. They're only here for a few days. And how do you feel about that? Evelyn considered the question honestly. How did she feel about Colton Hale riding away in 3 days? Disappointed, certainly. Regretful, maybe. But also something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like grief, which made no sense at all. You couldn't grieve something you never had. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something, she said slowly. And I'm not sure if I should step back or jump. What does your heart tell you? My heart told me to wait 5 years for a dead man. I'm not sure I trust its judgment. Your heart told you to have faith in love. That's not the same as being foolish. Martha set down her knitting and fixed Evelyn with a look that was equal parts stern and tender. That cowboy rode hundreds of miles to deliver news he didn't have to deliver. He checked on a boy he barely knew because he'd made a promise. He came back this spring because he said he would. Those aren't the actions of a man who takes his word lightly. I know. So what are you afraid of? The question hit harder than expected. What was she afraid of? Loss, certainly she'd lost Miles before she ever really had him. Pain, absolutely grief, had taught her how much love could hurt. But underneath those fears was something deeper, something she'd been avoiding acknowledging. I'm afraid I'll wait again, she whispered. I'm afraid I'll organize my life around someone else's plans, someone else's promises, and end up standing by another fence post watching another horizon. Then don't wait. Don't organize your life around anyone's plans but your own. Martha leaned forward. You love teaching here, you said so. You've built something that matters. If Colton Hale or any man wants to be part of that life, he can figure out how to make that work. But you don't have to chase him or follow him or wait for him to decide you're worth the trouble. You already know you're worth the trouble. The words settled over Evelyn like a benediction. She'd spent so long defining herself through Miles's absence, through what she'd lost, that she'd forgotten to notice what she'd gained. She had a home, a purpose, friends who cared about her students, who needed her. She'd built a life in Red Willow, and it was a good life, even if it wasn't the one she'd originally planned. Thank you, Martha. Don't thank me. Just promise you won't sell yourself short. If that cowboy's got any sense, he'll figure out you're exactly the kind of woman worth staying for. Evelyn went to bed that night with Martha's words echoing in her head and a feeling in her chest that might have been hope or might have been terror. Sometimes she was learning those two feelings were nearly identical. The next afternoon, Colton Hale arrived at the schoolhouse precisely at 2 o'clock. Evelyn's students, who'd been buzzing with excitement since she'd announced a special visitor, fell silent when he walked through the door. He was in his working clothes today, worn canvas trousers, a faded shirt, scuffed boots, and he moved with that slight limp that spoke of old injury and hard work. "Class, this is Mr. Hale. He's a trail scout with a cattle drive passing through our area, and he's graciously agreed to talk with us about his work." 18 pairs of eyes fixed on Colton with varying degrees of awe and curiosity. He took off his hat and gave them a small smile. "Morning, everyone. Or afternoon, I suppose. Thank you for having me." What followed was an hour of the best teaching Evelyn had ever witnessed. Colton spoke about the trail with a matter-of-fact eloquence that brought the work to life, the daily challenges of moving thousands of animals across hundreds of miles, the geography they covered, the weather, they endured the teamwork required to keep everything running smoothly. He answered questions with patience and honesty, never talking down to the children, but also never sugarcoating the harsh realities of trail life. When Sarah Henderson's daughter asked if it was dangerous, he nodded. "It can be. Cattle are unpredictable animals, and weather out here doesn't forgive mistakes. I've seen men hurt, seen them lost to rivers and storms. It's why we look out for each other. Your life might depend on the man riding next to you, and his might depend on you." When Thomas Brennan asked if he'd ever seen Indians, Colton's expression grew more thoughtful. "I've met many native peoples while traveling. Most encounters have been peaceful trading, sharing information about water sources and terrain. Some of the best guides I've worked with were natives who knew the land better than any map could show." He paused. "The newspapers like to print stories about violence and conflict, and those things happen. But most of what you read is sensationalism meant to sell papers. The reality is usually more complicated and less dramatic." Evelyn watched him navigate these questions with increasing admiration. He didn't preach or pontificate, just shared his experiences and let the students draw their own conclusions. When Lucas asked about his favorite part of the work, Colton's answer was immediate. "The sky. I know that sounds strange, but there's something about being out under all that open space, watching weather roll in from 50 miles away, seeing stars so thick they look like spilled milk. It reminds you how small you are and how big the world is. Makes your problems feel more manageable somehow." After the formal presentation, several students crowded around asking more questions while others examined the rope and branding iron Colton had brought as examples. Evelyn stood back, ostensibly supervising, but really just watching him interact with the children. He was natural with them, treating their questions as seriously as he would an adult's, and they responded to that respect with enthusiasm. Eventually, she called time, thanking Colton and dismissing the class. They filed out reluctantly, still chattering about cattle and trails and the vast sky Colton had described. When the last student had gone, Evelyn found herself alone with him in the suddenly quiet schoolhouse. "That was wonderful," she said. "You're a natural teacher. I just told them about my work. You did more than that. You opened their eyes to a world most of them will never see directly. You made them think about geography and weather and human nature. That's exactly what good teaching does." He ducked his head, clearly unused to such direct praise. "I enjoyed it. They're smart kids, curious. That Lucas especially, he soaks up information like a sponge." "He does. Having the Cheneys has given him stability, but having you as an example has given him something else. Hope, maybe. A vision of what kind of man he could become. I hope he becomes a better man than me." "Why would you say that?" Colton moved to the window, looking out at the prairie stretching beyond the town. "I'm 32 years old, Evelyn. I've been on the trail since I was 14. I own nothing but a horse, a saddle, and the clothes on my back. I sleep on the ground more often than in a bed. I've got no property, no permanent home, no prospects beyond the next drive." He turned back to face her. "That's not the kind of man anyone should aspire to be. That's the kind of man who kept a promise to a dying friend for 4 years. The kind of man who took responsibility for an orphaned boy and made sure he found a good home. The kind of man who rode back here because he said he would." She moved closer, her voice firm. "Those things define character, Colton, not property or permanence. Maybe, but character doesn't keep you warm at night or put food on the table. A woman deserves more than pretty words and good intentions." There it was, the thing they'd been dancing around since he'd arrived. The acknowledgement that this wasn't just about Lucas or Miles or closing chapters. This was about possibility, about two people circling each other with a mixture of attraction and caution. "Is that what you think I want?" Evelyn asked quietly. Property and security. Isn't that what everyone wants? I wanted that once. I thought Miles would give it to me, land, a house, a stable life. But I've learned that security can be built in different ways. I have a job, I love a home, I've made my own friends who've become family. I built that myself, Colton. I don't need someone to provide it for me. Then what do you need? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with everything they weren't quite saying. Evelyn thought about Miles, about the promises made in passion and broken by circumstance. She thought about the 5 years she'd spent waiting, organizing her life around someone else's plans. She thought about Martha's words the night before. I need someone who sees me as I am, not as who they want me to be. Someone who respects that I have a life here that matters to me. Someone who... She took a breath. Someone who understands that love isn't about waiting or following or giving up yourself. It's about building something together. Colton was very still, his dark eyes fixed on her face. And if the someone you're describing has to leave in 2 days, has to go north with a cattle drive because that's his job and his responsibility. Then he leaves, and I stay, and we figure out what comes after that when the time comes. That's not much of a promise. No, Evelyn agreed. But it's an honest one. I'm done with pretty promises that sound good, but don't hold up under pressure. I'd rather have an uncertain truth than a comfortable lie. Something shifted in his expression, relief maybe, or recognition. I'm coming back this way in the fall. The drive heads south in September, usually reaches Red Willow territory by early October. That's 5 months from now. That's a long time. It is. A lot can happen in 5 months. You might, he hesitated. You might meet someone else, someone with better prospects, someone who can stay. I might, she acknowledged. You might too. Trail camps have cooks and laundresses, I imagine. Women who understand that life. They do, but none of them spent 5 years standing by a fence post with that kind of faith. None of them built a school program from nothing or figured out how to teach 18 students of varying ages all at once. None of them look at the world the way you do, like it's full of possibility even when it's been hard. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. What are you saying? I'm saying I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since I left last spring. I'm saying I've written you a dozen letters in my head and never found the words to put on paper. I'm saying... He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. I'm saying I'd like permission to write to you. Real letters this time, not just news about Lucas. And I'd like to know if there's any chance that when I come back through in October, you might be willing to see me again. Not as the man who brought bad news or the cowboy who helped a boy, just as me. Her heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. This was the edge of the cliff, the moment of choice. She could step back, play it safe, protect herself from another potential loss. Or she could jump and trust that whatever happened, she'd survive it. I'd like that, she heard herself say. I'd like that very much. The smile that spread across his face was worth every moment of uncertainty. Yeah. She smiled back, feeling lighter than she had in years. But Colton, you need to understand I'm not waiting by any fence posts. I'm living my life. If you write, I'll write back. When you come through in October, I'll be glad to see you, but I won't stop living in the meantime. I wouldn't want you to. The woman who waits by fence posts isn't the one I'm interested in. The woman who builds schools and takes in orphans and decides to live instead of just survive, that's the woman I'd like to know better. Then you should know that woman has very definite opinions about a lot of things, doesn't suffer fools, and has been told she can be stubborn. I like stubborn. Stubborn means you know your own mind. And she's not interested in giving up her teaching position to follow anyone anywhere. Wouldn't dream of asking you to. Red Willow needs you more than any cattle drive needs another hand. They stood there in the empty schoolhouse, grinning at each other like fools, and Evelyn felt something in her chest unfurl, something that had been closed tight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe deeply. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Colton came by the boarding house to say goodbye to Martha, who fed him enough pie to last him to Montana and made him promise to look after himself. He visited the Cheneys again, spending an afternoon helping Robert with some heavy carpentry, while Ellen and Evelyn worked in the garden with Lucas. He came to the schoolhouse one more time, ostensibly to return a book one of the students had loaned him, but really just to see Evelyn again. They didn't say much during that visit. They didn't need to. Sometimes understanding existed in the spaces between words, in the way two people could occupy the same room and feel settled, feel right, feel like they were exactly where they belonged. "I'll write," he promised when he finally had to leave. "It might take a while for letters to reach you, but I'll write. I'll write back. And in October we'll see what happens. No promises beyond that." "No promises beyond that," he agreed. He took her hand, holding it between both of his. His palms were calloused from years of ranch work, warm and steady. "Thank you, Evelyn Hart, for giving me something to look forward to. Thank you for coming back, for keeping your word." Then he was gone, riding north with the cattle drive, and Evelyn stood by her schoolhouse steps. Not the fence post, she noted with satisfaction, watching the dust rise in the distance until it disappeared entirely. Martha found her there an hour later, still standing with her hand pressed to her chest, like she could hold the feeling there a little longer. "He's gone, then." "He's gone. And how do you feel?" Evelyn considered the question. How did she feel? Not grief-stricken, the way she'd felt when Miles's letters stopped coming. Not lost or abandoned or forgotten. Instead, she felt anticipatory, like she was standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. "I feel alive," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel completely alive." "Good. That's exactly how you should feel." Martha linked her arm through Evelyn's. "Now come inside. Sarah Henderson's been dying to interrogate you about that handsome cowboy, and I've been holding her off for 2 days. If we don't let her ask her questions soon, she's liable to burst." Evelyn laughed and let herself be led inside where her life, the one she'd built herself, was waiting. And if part of her was already counting the days until October, well, that was allowed. You could live fully in the present while still looking forward to the future. That wasn't waiting. That was hope. The months that followed had a quality Evelyn had never experienced before. They were full and fast and entirely her own. June brought the end of the school term and a summer program she organized for the students who wanted to continue learning. July was hot and dry, the prairie grass turning gold under the relentless sun. August brought thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like artillery fire, spectacular and occasionally dangerous. And through it all, letters arrived. Not many mail service to moving cattle drives was erratic at best, but enough. Colton wrote about the country they were passing through, the challenges of the trail, the men he worked with. His letters were practical rather than poetic, but they were honest, and she valued that more than flowery declarations. She wrote back about her students, about Lucas's progress, about the daily rhythms of Red Willow life. She told him about the new books she'd acquired for the school library and the summer program she was running. She described the thunderstorms and the way the prairie looked when lightning illuminated it, turning night to day for split seconds at a time. They were building something in those letters, not romance exactly, but understanding. Getting to know each other through words on paper, which felt oddly appropriate for a former teacher and a cowboy who spent more time with cattle than people. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the beginning of fall color. The school year started again with 20 students. This time word had spread that Red Willow had a good teacher, and 2 families had moved to town specifically to access her program. The town council, pleased with her work, had voted to increase her salary and fund improvements to the schoolhouse. She was in every measurable way thriving. But as October approached, she found herself thinking more and more about Colton, about the letters that had arrived regularly through the summer and then stopped, which made sense. The drive would be in the final push, now too busy for mail. About the promise they'd made to each other to see what happened when he returned. About the fact that she was nervous and excited in equal measure, which seemed ridiculous for a woman her age. "You're doing it again," Martha observed one evening in late September. They were in the boarding house parlor, Evelyn supposedly grading assignments, while Martha did her eternal knitting. "Doing what?" "Looking at that horizon like you're expecting it to deliver something." "I'm not looking at any horizon. I'm grading arithmetic." "You've been on the same page for 10 minutes, and I'm quite certain Mary Brennan's addition skills haven't gotten that much more fascinating." Martha set down her knitting. "He'll come when he comes, honey. Watching won't make it happen faster." "I'm not watching for him." "Of course not. Any more than I'm the Queen of England." Evelyn sighed and set down her pencil. "I'm being ridiculous, aren't I?" You're being human. There's a difference. Martha's expression softened. It's all right to look forward to seeing someone. That's not the same as organizing your whole life around them. Isn't it? Not even close. You're still teaching, still building your program, still living fully. The fact that you're also excited about seeing a particular cowboy again just means you're alive and interested in possibility. Those are good things. The drive arrived on October 3rd, announced by the same dust and thunder that had heralded it in spring. Evelyn was teaching when they passed, and she resolutely kept her attention on her students and away from the window. But she was aware of every minute ticking past, aware of the sounds outside, aware that somewhere in that moving mass of cattle and cowboys was a man she'd been thinking about for 5 months. She kept teaching through the afternoon, dismissed her students at the usual time, and walked back to the boarding house with a measured pace that hopefully suggested she wasn't in any particular hurry. Martha met her at the door with a knowing smile. "There's someone on the porch waiting for you. Been there about 20 minutes. I offered him coffee, but he said he'd rather wait until you got home." Evelyn's heart did something complicated in her chest. "Thank you, Martha." Colton was standing with his back to the door, looking out at the street. He'd cleaned up again, shaved, changed into clothes that weren't travel-stained. When he turned at the sound of the door opening, his face broke into a smile that felt like coming home. "Hello, Evelyn." "Hello, Colton." She'd imagined this moment 100 times over the summer, rehearsed what she might say, how she might act. But now that he was here standing on her porch with dust on his boots and hope in his eyes, all her careful plans evaporated. Instead, she just stood there looking at him, memorizing the details, the way his hair had gotten longer over the summer, the new lines around his eyes that suggested hard work and bright sun, the fact that he was favoring his bad leg more than he had in spring. 5 months, he said. Felt longer. It did. Your letters. They helped. Knowing what you were doing, how things were going, it made the trail feel less endless. Your letters helped too. I liked knowing you were out there seeing country I'll probably never see, experiencing things I can only imagine. They stood there in the awkward space between acquaintance and something more until finally Colton laughed softly. I feel like a kid at his first dance. Practiced what I'd say for weeks, and now I can't remember any of it. That broke the tension. Evelyn smiled. Then let's start simple. Would you like to take a walk? I could show you the improvements we've made to the schoolhouse, and you could tell me about the trail. I'd like that very much. They walked through Red Willow as the sun set, talking easily about surface things while feeling their way toward deeper waters. The schoolhouse improvements? New windows, a better stove, expanded shelving. The trail north, good weather. Mostly one bad river crossing, a young cow hand who'd proven himself capable and earned a permanent position. Lucas's latest letters he was reading at a level far beyond his age, now showing real promise. The final weeks of the drive, exhausting but successful, all the cattle accounted for good prices at market. It wasn't until they found themselves back at the fence post, her fence post. Though she hadn't intended to walk here, that the conversation turned more serious. I meant what I said in spring, Colton said, his hand resting on the weathered wood. About wanting to know you better. About being interested in whatever this might be. I meant what I said too. About living my life, not waiting. I noticed. Your letters were full of doing and building and growing. That's... He paused, searching for words. That's exactly what I hoped for. What I wanted for you. And what do you want for yourself? The question seemed to catch him off guard. What do I want? Yes. You spent 4 years carrying a promise for a dead man. You spend your working life helping other people move their cattle, build their fortunes, achieve their goals. But what do you want, Colton Hale? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon, where the last light was fading. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like he was testing each word before releasing it. I want land of my own. A small place, nothing grand but mine. Somewhere I could run a modest operation, enough cattle to make a living, enough space to breathe. I want to stop moving all the time, stop feeling like I'm passing through instead of belonging somewhere. He looked at her then. And I want someone to build that with. Not someone who will follow me around waiting for me to make all the decisions, but someone who's got her own dreams and goals. Someone who'd be a partner, not just a wife. Evelyn's breath caught. That's very specific. I've had 5 months to think about it, to figure out what I actually want instead of just taking whatever comes next. His hand moved from the fence post to cover hers where it rested on the wood. The thing is, everything I want requires time and saving and planning. I'm not there yet. I've been working as a trail scout because it pays better than regular cowhand work, and I've been saving every penny I can. But land isn't cheap, and building something takes time. How much time? A year, maybe. Maybe 2 if I want to do it right. He squeezed her hand gently. That's what I came here to tell you. That I'm interested, more than interested, but I can't offer you anything concrete right now beyond intentions and a plan, and I'd understand if that's not enough. If you can't or won't wait that long. There was that word again. Wait. Evelyn looked at their joined hands at the fence post that had once symbolized years of futile waiting at the horizon that had finally stopped taunting her with absences. I told you once I'm done with waiting, she said slowly, and I meant it. But Colton, that's not what you're asking me to do. You're not asking me to put my life on hold or organize everything around your plans. You're telling me what you're working toward and asking if I might be interested in the same thing. I suppose I am. Then here's what I think. I think you should keep working toward your goals. I'll keep working toward mine. We'll write to each other, see each other when the drives pass through, and figure out if what we feel now still holds true after a year or 2 of actually knowing each other. She turned her hand to lace her fingers through his. Because right now we're still mostly strangers who've exchanged some letters and had some conversations. That's not nothing, but it's not everything either. That's very practical. I'm a practical woman. Miles taught me that romance without foundation crumbles when tested. I'd rather build something solid even if it takes longer. Colton smiled, and in the dying light she could see relief and respect in equal measure. You're remarkable, you know that most women would want promises and declarations. I had promises and declarations once. They died in a mind collapse and left me with nothing but questions. She squeezed his hand. I'd rather have honest intentions and a realistic plan. Those feel more valuable to me now. Then that's what I'll give you. Honest intentions and a realistic plan. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was somehow more intimate than anything more dramatic would have been. Thank you, Evelyn, for understanding, for being patient with the reality instead of demanding the dream. Thank you for being honest about where you are instead of making promises you can't keep. They stood there as full dark fell, 2 people learning to navigate the space between what they wanted and what was possible, and Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. This was right. Not perfect, not easy, but right. Real instead of romantic, honest instead of idealized. When Colton walked her back to the boarding house, he didn't try to kiss her beyond that one brush of lips against her hand. He didn't make sweeping declarations or extract promises. He simply said good night, and that he'd see her tomorrow. They were staying in the area for 3 days before heading south. And Evelyn went inside feeling more certain of this uncertain thing than she'd ever felt about Miles's pretty promises of permanence. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in years she was looking forward to discovering what came next. The 3 days Colton stayed in Red Willow that October passed with a strange mixture of slowness and speed. Each moment felt stretched out significant, yet somehow the hours collapsed into themselves, until suddenly he was preparing to leave again and Evelyn was standing on the boarding house porch wondering where the time had gone. They'd spent those days doing remarkably ordinary things. He'd joined her and the Cheneys for another supper, watching Lucas demonstrate his improved reading skills with visible pride. They'd walked through town while she introduced him to the shopkeepers and families whose children she taught. He'd sat in the back of her schoolhouse for an afternoon, ostensibly mending some bridles, but really just watching her teach, and afterward told her she had a gift for making children feel both challenged and safe at the same time. That's the balance, she'd explained as they walked back toward the boarding house in the autumn twilight. Push them too hard and they shut down. Don't push them enough and they never discover what they're capable of. You have to know each child well enough to understand where that line is. Sounds like working with horses, or people, really. He'd smiled at her. You're doing important work, Evelyn. Those children are lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have them. They give me purpose. On his last evening in town, they'd taken the longest walk yet, ending up, inevitably it seemed, at the fence post as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Evelyn had noticed they kept gravitating to this spot, this marker of where her old life had ended and something new had begun. "All right," Colton set his hand, finding hers with an ease that suggested they'd been doing this for years rather than days. "More regularly this time, if I can manage it. We're wintering at a ranch about 200 miles south of here. The mail should be more reliable." 200 miles. She tried to picture the distance. That's closer than I expected. "We've been contracted to help with their winter operation fence mending equipment, repair breaking horses. It's good steady pay, and it means I can save more than I would drifting from job to job." He paused. "And it means I'm not so far away. If something happened, if you needed something, I could be here in a few days' ride." The implication hung between them. He was thinking ahead, planning for contingencies, making sure she wasn't alone the way she'd been alone for 5 years, waiting for miles. The consideration in that made her chest tight. "I'll write back," she promised, "and I'll expect you to keep me informed about your progress. This plan of yours saving for land, I want to know how it's going. The real details, not just pleasant generalities. You want me to discuss finances with you? I want you to treat me like a partner the way you said you wanted. Partners share the real information even when it's not romantic." His smile was slow and warm. "Yes, ma'am. I can do that." They'd said goodbye the next morning when the drive pulled out heading south toward winter quarters. It was a more public farewell this time, with Martha and several townspeople watching from the boarding house porch. Colton had shaken her hand with proper formality, but his thumb had traced a small circle on her palm that felt more intimate than a kiss. "Until spring," he'd said. "Until spring." And then he was gone again, riding away with his distinctive posture, that slight lean to favor his good leg becoming smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the autumn landscape. The days after his departure had a different quality than the previous year. Then she'd been processing grief and revelation, learning to live in truth rather than hope. Now she was simply living, teaching her students, managing her household, participating in the rhythms of Red Willow life, but with an undercurrent of pleasant anticipation. Not waiting, not exactly, but aware that something was developing, growing, taking shape in the space between letters and visits. November brought the first significant snow and a letter from Colton. He wrote about the ranch where they were wintering, a substantial operation run by a man named Harrison Blake, who was getting too old to manage everything himself and appreciated having experienced hands around. He described the work they were doing, the horses they were breaking, the repairs they were making. And then in a paragraph that made Evelyn read and reread several times, he wrote about a conversation he'd had with Blake. "The old man asked me what my plans were for the future, and I told him honestly, save up enough to buy my own place, something modest, but mine." He got this look on his face, thoughtful-like, and said he understood that ambition better than most. Then he asked if I'd be interested in staying on as foreman once the regular crew comes back in spring. Said he needs someone with a good head and steady hands to help run things, and the pay would be considerably better than trail scouting. I told him I'd think about it. The thing is, Evelyn, I keep thinking about what you said about building something solid instead of chasing romance. A foreman position would mean stability, better wages, the chance to save faster. But it would also mean less travel, and I'm not sure yet if that's what I want. I've been moving my whole adult life. The thought of staying in one place feels strange, though not unpleasant. Just strange. What do you think? And before you say it's my decision to make, I know that. But your perspective would help. You're the most practical person I know, and I trust your judgment. Evelyn had sat with that letter for 2 days before responding, thinking carefully about what counsel to offer. Finally, she wrote back with characteristic honesty. "You're asking the wrong question. It's not whether you want to stay in one place, it's whether you want what staying in one place could give you. If the foreman position gets you closer to your goal of owning land, then the discomfort of changing your pattern is worth it. We rarely get what we want without some sacrifice of what we're comfortable with. As for my perspective here, it is, you've spent years helping other people achieve their dreams by moving their cattle, protecting their investments, guiding their operations. Maybe it's time to let someone help you achieve yours. If Mr. Blake is offering good pay and a chance to save faster, that's not a trap, it's an opportunity. But Colton, you need to make sure it's what you want, not what you think I want or what seems most practical. Your life has to satisfy you, not just check boxes on someone else's list of respectability. His response came 3 weeks later, delayed by a storm that had closed the mail routes temporarily. I took the position. Blake seemed pleased, and I start officially in January when we finish the current repairs and the spring crew starts arriving. You were right about asking the wrong question. When I thought about it properly, what I want is to stop feeling like I'm passing through everywhere I go. The foreman job gives me that plus better pay, plus the chance to learn more about ranch management, which will serve me well when I eventually have my own place. Thank you for your counsel. Thank you for being honest instead of just telling me what you thought I wanted to hear. That's rarer than you might think. December was brutal. The temperature plummeted and snow fell in waves that buried fences and made travel nearly impossible. Evelyn kept the school open when she could, but sent students home early more often than not. The boarding house became a cocoon of warmth where she and Martha and the 3 other long-term residents huddled around fires and entertained each other with stories and card games. Lucas came to visit when the weather allowed, walking the 2 miles from the Cheney farm, bundled in so many layers, he looked like a small, determined snowman. He'd grown taller over the months, his face losing some of its gaunt wariness and filling out with the confidence that came from being loved and secure. "Mr. Colton wrote to me," he announced during one such visit, shaking snow from his coat. "He said he's working at a ranch now, as a foreman. That's important, right?" "Very important," Evelyn confirmed. "It means he's in charge of the other workers and helps manage the whole operation. He said maybe when I'm older, if I want to learn ranching, I could come work for him." Do you think he meant it? I think Colton Hale doesn't say things he doesn't mean. Lucas absorbed this, his expression serious in the way of children processing significant information. "Do you think he'll come back in the spring? Really come back?" "I think so." "Why?" "Because—" The boy hesitated, picking at a loose thread on his mittens. "Because Mrs. Cheney says sometimes men make promises to be nice, but they don't always keep them. Not because they're bad, but because life gets in the way. And I want him to come back." Evelyn's heart ached for the child who'd learned too young that the world didn't always keep its promises. "Mrs. Cheney is right that sometimes life interferes with people's intentions. But I believe Colton will come back if he possibly can, and if something prevents him, weather or work or circumstance, I believe he'll send word explaining why. That's what honorable people do." "Is he honorable?" "Yes, Lucas. I believe he is." "Good." The boy's face relaxed. "Mrs. Cheney also says you smile more when his letters come. She says it's nice to see you happy." Evelyn felt her cheeks warm. "Does she now?" "She does. She told Mr. Cheney that Mr. Colton is exactly the kind of man who'd be good for you, and Mr. Cheney said it's about time you had someone who made you smile like that." He looked up at her with those 2 old eyes. "I think so too. You were sad when I first met you. You're not sad anymore." Out of the mouths of children came truths that adults danced around. Evelyn pulled Lucas into a hug that he tolerated with good-natured patience. "Thank you, sweetheart. That's one of the nicest things anyone said to me." The letters continued through the winter, becoming the bright spots in the relentless cold and dark. Colton wrote about learning the full scope of ranch management, about the challenges of supervising men who were often older and more experienced than him, about Blake's mentorship and the skills he was acquiring. Evelyn wrote about her students' progress, about the book she was reading, about the plans she was making for expanding the school's curriculum in the spring. But woven through the practical updates were more personal revelations. He told her about his father dying when he was young, how he'd gone to work at 14 to help support his mother and sisters, how the trail had offered escape from poverty, even as it demanded everything from him. She told him about growing up in Boston society, about the suffocating expectations and the hunger for something more authentic about choosing teaching, because it was one of the few ways a woman could claim independence. They were building intimacy through words on paper, learning each other's histories and hopes, creating a foundation that felt solid precisely because it was being constructed slowly and deliberately. January brought a thaw that was almost cruel in its brevity, 3 days of warmth that melted snow and raised hopes before another storm swept in and froze everything harder than before. February was worse with blizzards that lasted days and temperatures so cold that water froze inside the schoolhouse despite the stove burning constantly. It was during one of these storms, when Evelyn had been trapped in the boarding house for 3 days straight, that Martha found her at the window staring out at the wall of white. Worrying won't make it stop snowing. I'm not worrying, I'm just looking. You're worrying. You haven't had a letter in 6 weeks and you're wondering if he's all right. Evelyn couldn't deny it. The lack of mail was understandable. The routes were effectively closed, but that didn't stop the small voice in her head that whispered concerns. What if something had happened? What if he was hurt or sick or had changed his mind about everything they'd been building? He's fine, Martha said firmly. Men like that don't break easy, and when the mail routes open up again, you'll probably get half a dozen letters all at once. She was right. When the weather finally broke in early March and the mail rider made it through for the first time in weeks, Evelyn received 5 letters from Colton, each one dated progressively later through the winter. She read them in order following the arc of his winter, the challenges of the storms, an injury to one of the ranch hands he'd had to manage, Blake's increasing reliance on his judgment, and in the last letter dated just a week earlier, news that made her heart skip. Blake's health isn't what it was. He had a spell last month that scared everyone, and the doctor says he needs to slow down considerably. He's asked me to take on even more responsibility, which I'm willing to do, but it's made me realize how precarious everything is. A man can build for decades and lose it all to a failing heart. It's made me think about time differently, about not waiting for the perfect moment because perfect moments don't exist, about recognizing when something or someone is worth taking a risk for. I'll be coming through Red Willow in April as soon as the trails are passable. I need to see you, Evelyn. There are things I need to say in person, not in a letter, important things. I hope that's all right. I hope you'll be willing to hear them. She read the letter 3 times, trying to decode what important things might mean. Part of her knew, of course. Part of her had been waiting for this shift, this moment, when intention moved toward action. But another part of her, the part that had learned caution from loving and losing Miles, was afraid to assume, afraid to hope too much. What is it? Martha had noticed her expression. Bad news. I'm not sure. Potentially significant news. She handed over the letter, watching Martha's face as she read. Oh my, that man is working himself up to something. Yes, but what, honey, I love you, but you can be remarkably obtuse for someone so intelligent. Martha handed back the letter. He's going to propose, or at the very least, he's going to declare himself properly and see if you're interested in moving forward. He can't propose. We barely know each other. We've spent maybe 10 days total in each other's company. You've been corresponding for months. You know each other's minds, each other's dreams, each other's character. Sometimes that's more important than time spent in the same room. Martha's expression softened. And honey, you're ready. Whether you want to admit it or not, you're ready for this. I don't know what I'm ready for. Then you'll find out in April. April arrived with the kind of weather that made Wyoming natives wax poetic. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, the prairie coming back to life after months of dormancy. Evelyn's students were restless with spring fever, and she found herself equally distracted watching the southern road more often than she cared to admit. The letter came before the man did. Colton wrote that he'd be arriving on April 15th, weather permitting, and would be staying at the hotel rather than camping with any cattle drive. He was coming specifically to see her, taking time away from his foreman duties with Blake's blessing and encouragement. I have something to ask you. Something important that I need to ask in person, face to face, so you can see that I'm serious. I'll understand if your answer is no. I'll understand if you need more time. But I'm really hoping that you might be willing to at least consider what I have to say. Until the 15th, Colton Evelyn showed the letter to no one but its contents, occupied her thoughts constantly. She found herself alternating between anticipation and terror, excitement and doubt. What would she say if he did propose? Was she ready for that kind of commitment? Did she want to be? The questions chased each other in circles until she was exhausted from thinking. The 14th of April was a Tuesday, which meant a full day of teaching. Evelyn threw herself into lessons with perhaps too much energy, keeping her students engaged until the final bell. She was cleaning the blackboard when she heard the schoolhouse door open behind her. "I know I'm a day early." She turned to find Colton standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his hair dusted with snow. Snow! In mid-April. She looked past him and saw that it was indeed snowing fat, wet flakes that probably wouldn't stick but were falling nonetheless with determined enthusiasm. "You're a day early," she agreed, her voice not quite steady. "And it's snowing. I couldn't wait. And yes, Wyoming weather is making a point about something, I'm not sure what." He stepped fully into the schoolhouse, and she could see the signs of hard travel, the dust on his clothes, the weariness around his eyes, the way he was favoring his bad leg more than usual. "I rode straight through from the ranch. Took me 2 days, and I probably shouldn't have pushed that hard, but I needed to see you." "Colton, let me say this before I lose my nerve." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, the tension in his shoulders. "I know we agreed to take things slow. I know we said we'd see how we felt after really getting to know each other. And I know it's only been 6 months since we started, whatever this is." "It's been 6 months, she confirmed quietly. 6 months of letters and brief visits and trying to build something across hundreds of miles. 6 months of thinking about you every day and wondering if what I feel is real or just the romanticism of distance." He set his hat on one of the student desks, freeing his hands. "And then this winter, when we couldn't communicate for weeks, when I was stuck at the ranch wondering if you were safe and warm and if you thought about me even half as much as I thought about you, I realized something." "What did you realize?" "That I don't want to do this carefully anymore. I don't want to build slowly and cautiously and sensibly. I want—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Evelyn, I'm in love with you, completely, thoroughly, inconveniently in love with you. And I know that's not what we agreed to, and I know it might be too fast or too much, but it's the truth. I love you." The words hung in the air of the schoolhouse, and Evelyn felt something in her chest crack open, not breaking, but opening like ice, giving way to spring thaw. She'd been loved before, or thought she had been. Miles had loved her with the passion of wartime, with promises made urgent by the possibility of death. But this felt different. This felt like Colton had looked at her clearly, seen exactly who she was, practical and stubborn and independent, and loved her not despite those qualities, but because of them. "Say something," he said quietly. "Please. Even if it's no, just say something." "I love you too." The words came out steadier than she expected, carrying the weight of certainty. "I've been trying not to, or trying not to admit it because it seemed too fast and I was afraid of being wrong again. But I love you, Colton Hale. I love your honesty and your integrity and the way you keep your promises. I love how you treat Lucas with respect and how you talk about your work and how you never once asked me to be someone I'm not." His face transformed, relief and joy chasing across his features. Yeah. He closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her throat tight. "I want to build a life with you, not you fitting into my life or me fitting into yours, but us building something together, something new. I don't want to leave Red Willow." She had to say it had to be clear. "My students need me, and I've built something here that matters." "I know, and I'm not asking you to leave. Blake's ranch is only 200 miles south. I can be here when you need me, and you can be there when I need you. It's not perfect, but it's workable." 200 miles is a long distance. It is, but it's not insurmountable. And Evelyn, he took a breath. "Blake's been talking about selling me a portion of his land. Says he's getting too old to manage the full spread, and would rather see it go to someone he trusts than have it divided up among strangers after he dies. If I can save enough for the down payment, I could have my own place by next year. Maybe the year after. And it would be close enough that I could ride here regularly. Or you could come there, or we could figure out something that works for both of us." "That's still hypothetical." "It is, but it's closer to real than anything I've ever had before." His thumbs stroked across her cheekbones, a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting. "Marry me, Evelyn. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday soon. Marry me and let's figure out the details together as we go." I'm not promising perfection or ease, but I'm promising honesty and effort and love. That's all I've got to offer, but it's yours if you want it. She should ask for time, should be practical and careful and measured, should make a list of concerns and logistics and potential problems. But standing in her schoolhouse with snow falling outside and Colton's hands warm on her face and his heart laid bare before her, Evelyn discovered she was done with being careful. Yes, 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 I'll marry you. Someday soon, like you said, when the timing makes sense, but yes. She smiled up at him. Though I'm keeping my teaching position. I wouldn't dream of asking you to give it up, and I want us to be practical about the living arrangements. If you're 200 miles away most of the time, we need to figure out how to make that work without either of us feeling like we're sacrificing everything. Agreed. We'll figure it out. His smile was incandescent. We'll figure all of it out together. And Colton, I need you to understand that I'm not the woman you might have imagined when you were carrying Miles's promise all those years. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I don't suffer fools. I'll argue with you when I think you're wrong, and I won't always defer to your judgment just because you're the man. Good. I don't want someone who defers. I want someone who challenges me to be better. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Can I kiss you now? I've been dreaming about kissing you for months, and if I don't do it soon, I might lose my mind. Yes, she breathed. Yes, you can kiss me. And he did slowly and thoroughly, like he was memorizing the moment. It was nothing like the desperate kisses she'd shared with Miles before he left for war. Those had been urgent and grasping, trying to hold on to something already slipping away. This was different. This was a promise being made and received, a beginning rather than an ending. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colton laughed softly. I should probably ask you more properly, with a ring and everything. Do you have a ring? Not yet. I wanted to make sure you'd say yes before I spent money I'm saving for land. He caught her expression and laughed again. I know. Not romantic, but practical, like you said you wanted. I appreciate the practicality. She straightened his collar, a gesture that felt both domestic and intimate. But Colton, I don't need a fancy ring. Something simple is fine. Better to save the money for more important things. You're sure? I'm sure. I had fancy things in Boston and was miserable. I'd rather have simple and honest. He pulled her close again, his arms wrapping around her in a way that made her feel simultaneously protected and seen. How did I get this lucky? Finding you waiting by that fence post. You kept a promise to a dying man. Maybe the universe was rewarding you. Or maybe you were always meant to be found. They stood there in the empty schoolhouse while snow fell outside, two people who'd found each other through grief and letters and honest intention, and Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt since before Miles died, absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The news spread through Red Willow with the speed of wildfire. By the time Evelyn and Colton emerged from the schoolhouse, Martha somehow already knew and was waiting on the boarding house porch with a smile that suggested she'd win any I told you so competition. Well, Shiki, she called out, do I need to start planning a wedding? How did you? Evelyn started. Honey, that man rode into town looking like he was heading into battle or a proposal, and given how you've been these past weeks, I knew which it was. So, she raised an eyebrow. Did he ask? He asked. I said yes. Martha let out a whoop that brought half the boarding house residents to the windows. It's about time. Sarah Henderson owes me $5. She thought he'd wait until summer. You were betting on us. Evelyn felt her face heat. Of course we were. This is Red Willow, honey. Entertainment is limited. She beckoned them up to the porch. Come inside. I've got coffee on and you both look frozen. We need to hear all the details. The next few hours passed in a blur of congratulations and questions. The Cheneys arrived with Lucas, who hugged both Evelyn and Colton with fierce joy before announcing that he'd known they'd get married because it was obvious they liked each other. Ellen cried happy tears while Robert shook Colton's hand with the gravity of a father blessing a union. Other townspeople stopped by Sarah Henderson, smugly collecting her $5 from Martha George Brennan, offering to provide supplies for a celebration even Samuel Curtis appearing briefly to offer stiff congratulations before retreating with his dignity mostly intact. Through it all, Colton stayed close to Evelyn's side, his hand finding hers whenever possible, his eyes tracking her movements with an attention that made her feel cherished. This was real, she kept thinking. This was actually happening. She was engaged to be married to a man she loved who loved her back, and it wasn't built on wartime passion or desperate promises, but on honest foundation and genuine compatibility. Late that evening, after the visitors had finally departed and Martha had tactfully retired to give them privacy in the parlor, Evelyn and Colton sat together on the settee discussing practical matters. "When?" she asked. "Not the proposal I know we said someday soon, but specifically when July," he suggested. "That gives us 3 months to plan for you to finish the school year properly, for me to make arrangements at the ranch, and it's not so long that we have to wait forever." July works, after the students are on summer break. She worried at her lower lip. "Where would we live? I can't give up my position here, but you can't leave your foreman job." "I've been thinking about that. What if we live apart during the week you hear me at the ranch, and together on weekends and holidays? It's not ideal, but it's only temporary until I can buy that land from Blake and set up something closer." Living apart feels strange for newlyweds. It does. But we're not conventional people, Evelyn. We don't have to do things the way everyone else does. He squeezed her hand. And honestly, I'd rather have a marriage that's a bit unconventional, but real than a traditional arrangement where one of us gives up everything important to them. She leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "My sister will think I'm insane. Getting married to a cowboy I've known less than a year, agreeing to live apart most of the time. What do you think?" "I think it's the sanest decision I've made in years, maybe ever." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down in the hearth. Outside, the unseasonable snow had stopped, leaving the world clean and quiet. "Tell me about the land Blake wants to sell you," Evelyn said eventually. "Is it good land? Would it support cattle?" "It's excellent land. Creek runs through it, good grazing timber for building. He's talking about selling me 200 acres for a price I can almost afford if I keep saving at my current rate." 200 acres? She tried to picture it. That's substantial. It is. Enough to run a small operation, maybe 50 head to start. I'd need to build a house, outbuildings, corrals. It would take time, but it's doable. He paused. "I keep thinking about what that house might look like, what you might want in it." "I want windows facing east," she heard herself say, "so I can watch the sunrise while I have my morning coffee." Colton went very still. "Miles promised you that, didn't he?" "In his letters?" "He did. It was one of the things he described, a house with windows facing the sunrise." She sat up to look at Colton directly. "But I'm not asking you to replicate his promises. I'm telling you what I want. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. With Miles, I was agreeing to his vision of our life together. With you, I'm helping create a shared vision. I get a say in what we build. That matters." Understanding crossed his face. "You're right. That's different." He brought her hand to his lips. "East-facing windows it is, then. What else?" "A proper kitchen. I'm not much of a cook, but I'd like to learn, and I can't do that in a space that's cramped or poorly equipped." "East-facing windows and a proper kitchen. What else?" "Shelves for books. Lots of shelves. And a table big enough for guests because I want Lucas to feel welcome whenever he visits. And a porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch the sunset." "I can do all that. Might not be fancy, but I can make it solid and comfortable." He smiled at her. "This is nice. Planning something together instead of just hoping it works out." "It is nice." She settled back against him. "Though we should probably figure out the wedding itself before we get too carried away planning the house." "What do you want for the wedding?" "Small, intimate. Just people who actually care about us rather than a big community spectacle." She thought about her sister's wedding back in Boston, the hundreds of guests, the elaborate production that had cost a fortune and felt more like a performance than a celebration. "Maybe at the church here in town with Reverend Matthews officiating. That sounds perfect. And Lucas as our ring bearer." "Absolutely. He'd be crushed if we didn't include him." She smiled. "Ellen will want to help with the preparations, and Martha will probably take over the entire thing if we let her." "Should we let her?" "Probably. She's better at organizing than either of us, and she'll enjoy it." Evelyn laced her fingers through his. Are you sure about this, Colton? Really sure? Because once we announce a date and start planning it, becomes real in a way that's hard to take back. I'm sure. Are you? She thought about the question honestly. Was she sure she'd been sure about Miles too, and that had ended in grief and years of waiting? But this felt different in every way that mattered. Colton wasn't promising her a fantasy, he was offering her reality with all its complications and imperfections. He wasn't asking her to give up everything to follow him, he was figuring out how to build a life that honored both of their needs. He wasn't making grand declarations about forever, he was showing up, doing the work, keeping his promises one day at a time. I'm sure, she said firmly. More sure than I've been of anything in a long time. Good. He kissed her temple. Then July it is. July 15th, if that date works for you. Exactly 3 months from when I came here to propose. July 15th is perfect. They sat there planning details until the fire died completely and the cold began to seep in, and even then, Evelyn was reluctant to let the evening end. This feeling, this sense of partnership and possibility was something she'd never quite experienced before. With Miles, everything had been urgent and uncertain, colored by war and distance. With Colton, there was stillness at the center of things, a calm certainty that allowed her to breathe deeply for the first time in years. When he finally walked back to the hotel where he'd taken a room, she stood on the boarding house porch watching him go, and for once, she wasn't watching him leave with dread or sorrow. She was watching with anticipation, knowing he'd be back tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the days to come. Not as someone passing through her life, but as someone choosing to stay in it, choosing to build something lasting with her. Martha found her there still standing in the cold long after Colton had disappeared into the darkness. You all right, honey? I'm better than all right. I'm happy. She said it with wonder, like the feeling was so foreign she needed to name it, to believe it. Martha, I'm actually happy. It's about time. The older woman put an arm around her shoulders. You've earned this, Evelyn. You've earned every bit of joy that comes your way. Have I? Sometimes I wonder if I should have tried harder with Miles, if I should have gone to South Pass City myself instead of waiting in Red Willow. If I'd done things differently, then you still would have found a dead man, only you'd have done it sooner and with less support around you. Martha's voice was firm. Stop second-guessing the past. Miles is gone. That's sad and tragic, but it's also done. What you have now with Colton that's real and present, and yours to keep if you stop sabotaging yourself with guilt. I'm not... You are. I can see it in your eyes. You're wondering if you deserve this, if it's somehow a betrayal of Miles's memory to be happy with someone else. Martha turned Evelyn to face her. Listen to me. Miles would want you to be happy. Any man worth loving would want that. And from everything Colton told you about him, Miles was worth loving. Honor his memory by living fully, not by staying stuck in grief. The words hit something deep, something Evelyn had been avoiding acknowledging. She had been feeling guilty, guilty for moving on, guilty for loving someone else, guilty for being happy when Miles had died before experiencing his own dreams. You're right, she said quietly. You're right, and I know it, but knowing and feeling are different things. Then feel your way through it. Feel the guilt and the grief and the love all at once, because that's what being human means. But don't let the guilt win. Don't let it rob you of this. Evelyn hugged Martha tightly, grateful beyond words for this woman who'd become more than a landlady, more than a friend. She'd become the mother figure Evelyn had needed when she arrived in Red Willow, alone and grieving and lost. Thank you, she whispered. For everything, for taking me in 5 years ago, for putting up with my moods, for pushing me when I needed it. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Nonsense, you're stronger than you think. I just helped you remember that. Martha patted her back. Now get inside before you catch your death of cold. We have a wedding to plan, and I have opinions about everything. The next 3 months passed in a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Colton stayed in Red Willow for a week after proposing helping where he could with wedding plans and spending as much time with Evelyn as propriety allowed. When he had to return to the ranch, the goodbye was difficult but not devastating. They both knew he'd be back, that this separation was temporary, that they were building towards something permanent. The letters during this period took on a different quality, more playful, more intimate, full of the small details and private jokes that marked genuine closeness. He wrote about Blake's reactions to the news, pleased and supportive, insisting on giving them a wedding gift of furniture for their future home. She wrote about her students' excitement and how Lucas had appointed himself unofficial wedding planner, offering detailed opinions on everything from flower arrangements to the menu. Ellen Chaney did indeed take over much of the organization, working with Martha to create a celebration that was modest but heartfelt. The church was booked. The Reverend consulted invitations hand-delivered to the small guest list. Evelyn's sister sent a letter from Boston that managed to be both congratulatory and concerned, full of questions about whether Evelyn had really thought this through. And wouldn't she prefer to come home for a proper Boston wedding? Evelyn wrote back with firm but loving honesty. Red Willow was home. Home now. Colton was her choice, and she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. The dress was the last piece to fall into place. Ellen and Martha had both insisted she needed something new, something special, and they'd pooled their resources to purchase beautiful cream-colored fabric from a traveling merchant. Ellen, who was skilled with the needle, had spent weeks sewing a dress that was simple but elegant, with lace at the collar and cuffs, and tiny pearl buttons up the back. When Evelyn tried it on for the final fitting a week before the wedding, she barely recognized herself in Martha's mirror. She looked happy. That was the difference. 5 years ago, she'd looked haunted. Now she looked like someone anticipating joy rather than bracing for loss. "Oh, honey," Ellen breathed, "you're beautiful." "It's a beautiful dress." "It's not the dress. It's you." Martha dabbed at her eyes. "You're glowing." Evelyn looked at her reflection and had to admit they were right. She was glowing. She was happy. And in 1 week she'd be married to a good man who loved her and whom she loved in return. After everything, after Miles, after the grief, after the years of waiting and wondering, she was finally moving forward into a future she wanted. The night before the wedding, Colton arrived in Red Willow with Harrison Blake in tow. The older man was weathered and slow-moving but sharp-eyed, and he greeted Evelyn with the kind of assessment that suggested he was making sure his foreman hadn't lost his mind. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he smiled and said, You'll do just fine. Colton needs someone with backbone, and you look like you've got plenty." "Thank you, I think." "It's a compliment. Most women would want to gentle him down, make him more civilized. But civilization's overrated. Better to have someone who understands what he is and loves him anyway." That night following tradition, Evelyn stayed at the boarding house while Colton took a room at the hotel. She lay awake long into the darkness, not nervous exactly, but alert, aware that tomorrow would mark a clear before and after in her life. Tomorrow she'd become someone's wife. Tomorrow she'd stand in front of the community and make promises that were real and binding and permanent. And unlike with Miles, she'd be standing across from the man she was promising herself to. He'd be there, present, real. The thought made her smile into the darkness. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. Morning came with this kind of crystalline clarity that made everything feel significant. Evelyn woke before dawn, pulled from sleep by anticipation rather than anxiety, and lay in her boarding house bed watching the light change through her window. Today was her wedding day. Today she would marry Colton Hale. The reality of it settled over her like a benediction. Martha appeared at her door with coffee and toast just as the sun broke over the horizon. "Couldn't sleep either," the older woman confessed, settling onto the edge of the bed. "I kept thinking about all the things that need to happen today and worrying I'd forgotten something crucial." "Have you forgotten anything?" "Not a blessed thing, but that doesn't stop the worrying." Martha handed her the coffee, watching as Evelyn took that first grateful sip. "How are you feeling? Nervous?" "Surprisingly calm. Is that strange?" "It's perfect. You should be calm. This isn't a leap into the unknown. You've done the work, asked the hard questions, built something real. Today's just making it official." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Martha spoke again, her voice careful. "Your sister sent another telegram. Arrived yesterday evening. She's sorry she couldn't make it, but sends her love and blessings." Evelyn had known her sister wouldn't come. The journey from Boston was too long, too expensive, and Julia had 3 small children who couldn't be left. Still, a small part of her had hoped. It's all right. I understand. She also sent money, quite a bit of it actually, with a note saying it's for you to use however you want. No strings, no expectations, just her way of supporting you. That made Evelyn's throat tight. Julia had never fully understood her decision to come west, had written concerned letters for years about Evelyn wasting herself in a frontier town. But this gesture spoke of acceptance even if it came from a distance. That was kind of her. Family shows love in different ways. Doesn't always look like we expect, but it's love nonetheless. Martha stood smoothing her skirts. Now we need to get you bathed and dressed. Ellen will be here in an hour with the dress and Sarah Henderson's bringing flowers from her garden. We've got a wedding to prepare for. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Evelyn bathed in the hip tub Martha had filled with hot water, washing her hair with the lavender soap Ellen had made specially. Sarah arrived with armfuls of wildflowers and prairie roses, their fragrance filling the boarding house. Ellen appeared with the dress carefully wrapped in muslin, her face glowing with pride in her handiwork. I finished the last button just this morning, she said, unwrapping it with the care of someone revealing something precious. Oh, Evelyn, I hope you love it. The dress was even more beautiful than Evelyn remembered from the fitting. The cream fabric caught the light, and Ellen's meticulous stitching created a garment that was both elegant and practical, exactly what Evelyn would have chosen for herself if she'd had the skill to make it. Getting into the dress required help from all three women, with Martha managing the tiny pearl buttons while Ellen arranged the skirts, and Sarah pinned up Evelyn's hair in a style that was sophisticated without being overly elaborate. When they finally stepped back to let her see herself in the mirror, Evelyn barely recognized the woman looking back. I look like a bride, she said with wonder. You are a bride, honey. Martha's voice was thick with emotion, and a beautiful one at that. There was a knock at the door, and Lucas's voice called out tentatively. Miss Hart, Mrs. Cheney said I could come up if you're decent. Come in, Lucas. The boy entered, stopping short when he saw her. He was dressed in new clothes the Cheneys had purchased for the occasion. Dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, a vest that made him look older than his 9 years. In his hands, he carried a small box. You look like a princess, he breathed, and you look very handsome. Is that a new vest? Mr. Cheney said every young man needs a proper vest for important occasions. He held out the box. I made this for you. Well, Mr. Cheney helped, but I did most of it. Inside the box was a delicate wooden carving of a fence post with a bird perched on top. It was rough in places, clearly the work of inexperienced hands, but the care in every detail was evident. Lucas, this is beautiful. Mr. Colton told me about how you used to wait by the fence post, how that's where everything started, kind of, so I thought... He ducked his head, suddenly shy. I thought maybe you'd want to remember it. Not the sad parts, but the part where something good came from something hard. Evelyn knelt down, not caring about the dress, and pulled the boy into a hug. This is the most thoughtful gift anyone's ever given me. Thank you, sweetheart. You're not mad that I brought up the fence post Mrs. Cheney said maybe I shouldn't. I'm not mad. Not even a little. She held him at arm's length so he could see her face. That fence post was where I learned to stop waiting and start living. It's where I met Colton. It's part of our story, and I'm glad to remember it. Robert appeared at the door, then looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best. Sorry to interrupt, but it's time. The church is filling up, and Reverend Matthews is asking when the bride will arrive. The walk to the church was short, only 3 blocks, but Evelyn insisted on walking rather than riding. She wanted to feel the earth under her feet, wanted to arrive at her wedding on her own power, rather than being delivered like a package. Martha and Ellen walked beside her while Robert and Lucas went ahead to ensure everything was ready. Nervous yet? Sarah asked. She joined them on the walk, carrying the bouquet of wildflowers she'd assembled. No, still calm. Evelyn smiled at the women flanking her. Is that wrong? Shouldn't I be more nervous? Why would you be nervous? You're marrying a good man who loves you in front of people who care about you in a town you've made your home. There's nothing to be nervous about. Martha squeezed her arm. You're just ready. Finally, blessedly ready. The church came into view, its simple white structure somehow beautiful in the July sunshine. People were gathered outside townspeople who'd known Evelyn for 5 years, who'd watched her arrive grieving and grow into herself, who'd supported her teaching and her programs, and now wanted to celebrate this next chapter. When they saw her approaching, a cheer went up that made her laugh and cry simultaneously. Inside the church was full. Every pew was occupied, and people stood along the walls when the seating ran out. Someone, probably Martha, had arranged wildflowers on every available surface, their colors bright against the plain wooden interior. At the front, Reverend Matthews waited with his Bible, and beside him stood Colton. He'd cleaned up beautifully. His dark suit was clearly new, probably purchased specially for this occasion. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and when he saw her enter at the back of the church, his expression transformed into something so full of love and wonder that Evelyn felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it. Lucas took his position as ring-bearer with solemn importance, carrying the small pillow Ellen had made with the two simple gold bands resting on top. Robert offered Evelyn his arm, and she accepted, gratefully glad to have this good man give her away since her own father had passed years before. "You sure about this?" Robert asked quietly as they prepared to walk down the aisle. "Completely sure." "Good, because that cowboy up there looks at you like you hung the moon, and any fool can see you feel the same about him. That's rare, Evelyn. That's worth everything." The traditional wedding march was played on the church's wheezing organ by Mrs. Morrison, who was enthusiastic if not precisely accurate. But the music hardly mattered. What mattered was walking down that aisle toward Colton, seeing his eyes track her every step, feeling the certainty in her bones that this was right. When she reached the front and Robert placed her hand in Colton's, the rightness of it intensified. His hand was warm and slightly calloused, steady and strong, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt anchored in the best possible way. Reverend Matthews began the ceremony, his words about love and commitment and partnership washing over Evelyn like a blessing. She barely heard the specifics, too focused on Colton's face, on the way he was looking at her like she was the only person in the entire world. When it came time for the vows, Colton went first, his voice steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "Evelyn, I promise to love you honestly and completely, in good times and hard times. I promise to respect your independence and support your dreams. I promise to be your partner, not your keeper, and to build a life with you rather than asking you to fit into mine. I promise to keep showing up, keep being honest, and keep choosing you every single day." He paused, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "And I promise that no matter how far apart we are during any given week, you'll always be the person I'm coming home to." She had to blink back tears before she could speak her own vows. "Colton, I promise to love you with my whole heart, bringing all of myself to this marriage, my strengths and my stubbornness, my dreams and my doubts. I promise to trust you with my truth and to receive yours with grace. I promise to be your partner in building something new, something that honors who we both are. And I promise that whether we're together or apart, you'll always be the person I'm building toward, the person I'm choosing today and every day after." Lucas came forward with the rings, his face serious with the weight of his responsibility. The bands were simple gold, unadorned, exactly what they'd wanted. Colton slipped one onto Evelyn's finger with hands that trembled slightly, and she returned the gesture, sliding his ring into place with a sense of sealing something sacred. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Matthews intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Colton, you may kiss your bride." And he did sweetly and thoroughly, while the entire congregation erupted in applause and cheers. When they broke apart, both grinning, Evelyn felt lighter than she had in years. Married. She was married. She'd taken the leap, made the promise, chosen the partnership. And it felt exactly right. The celebration afterward was held at the boarding house with food provided by seemingly everyone in Red Willow. Tables had been set up in the yard laden with dishes both savory and sweet. Someone had rigged up lanterns for when darkness fell, and another person had brought a fiddle, promising music for dancing later. Evelyn and Colton moved through the celebration, receiving congratulations and well wishes, but Evelyn was most touched by the quiet conversations that happened in the margins. George Brennan telling her he was proud of how she'd built herself a life here. Sarah Henderson admitting she'd been wrong to pity Evelyn all those years, that she clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Even Samuel Curtis appeared to offer genuine congratulations, saying he hoped they'd be very happy together. But it was Harrison Blake's words that struck deepest. The older man pulled Evelyn aside as the sun began to set, his weathered face serious. "I want you to know something," he said without preamble. "That foreman of mine, your husband, now he's one of the best men I've ever known. Honest to his bones, hard-working, loyal. You could do a lot worse." "I know. That's why I married him." "Good. But here's the thing I wanted to tell you. I'm selling him that land we discussed. 200 acres, good water, decent grazing. And I'm giving him better terms than I mentioned before, lower down payment, longer to pay it off. Because I want to see him settled before I'm too old to care." He fixed her with a sharp look. "But land's only as good as what you build on it. He's going to need help making it into something. Not just labor, though, that too, but vision. Someone who can see what it could be, not just what it is." "I can do that." "I believe you can. That's why I'm telling you this. You're partners now in every sense. So partner with him on this. Don't just support his dream, make it yours too. That's how you build something that lasts." The words stayed with Evelyn through the rest of the evening. When the dancing started and Colton swept her into his arms for the first dance, she whispered Blake's news to him. "He told you I was going to wait until tomorrow to bring it up, didn't want to distract from today." "This doesn't distract from today. It's part of today. Part of what we're building." She looked up at him as they swayed to the fiddle music. 200 acres, Colton. That's a real start." "It is. And Blake's terms are generous enough that I can make the down payment with what I've saved. We could start building as early as next spring." She repeated, tasting the word. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." He pulled her closer, not caring who might see. "Thank you, Evelyn, for saying yes. For taking a chance on someone who doesn't have much to offer besides intentions and hard work. You have more to offer than you realize, and I'm not taking a chance, I'm making a choice. There's a difference." They danced until the stars came out, until Lucas fell asleep on Ellen's shoulder, until the older guests began to drift home, and only the young people remained. Finally, Martha shooed them off, insisting they needed privacy and that everyone else could clean up. Colton had rented the best room at the hotel for their wedding night, their first night as husband and wife. As they walked the short distance, hand in hand, Evelyn felt a flutter of nervousness that had been absent all day. This was real now. This was permanent. They weren't just promising anymore, they were beginning. But when they reached the room and Colton closed the door behind them, the nervousness faded. He kissed her softly, then rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Mrs. Hale." "I love you too, Mr. Hale." She smiled at the sound of her new name. "Though professionally, I'll probably keep using Hart, for the school records and such." "Whatever makes sense to you. You're still you, just with a wedding ring now." He kissed her again, deeper this time. "We don't have to rush anything tonight. We have all the time in the world." "We do," she agreed. "But Colton, I don't want to wait anymore. I've done enough waiting to last a lifetime." What followed was tender and awkward and perfect in the way that first times often are more about connection than perfection, more about learning each other than performing passion. They laughed when things didn't work quite right, murmured reassurances when vulnerability felt sharp, and fell asleep eventually in a tangle of limbs and contentment. The next morning they woke to sunshine streaming through the window and the realization that they had exactly 2 days before Colton needed to return to Blake's ranch and Evelyn needed to prepare for the upcoming school year. 2 days of being together before the practical realities of their arrangement kicked in. They spent those days quietly walking around Red Willow, visiting with the Cheneys and Lucas, making plans for the future. Colton wanted to start clearing the land Blake was selling him as soon as the sale was finalized. Evelyn wanted to know exactly where on the property he was thinking of building so she could start imagining how the house might be oriented. "East-facing windows," he reminded her with a smile, "and a proper kitchen, and shelves for books." "I remember." "What do you want?" "We've talked about what I want, but what about you?" He considered this, his arm around her shoulders, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the world go by. "I want a barn that's solid enough to weather any storm. I want corrals that are well built and functional. I want space room to expand when we're ready, room to breathe, room to build something that lasts." "That sounds perfect." On their last evening together before separation, they walked out to the fence post one final time. It stood where it had always stood, weathered and solid, marking the edge between town and wilderness. Evelyn ran her hand over the wood, feeling the grooves worn by years of wind and weather. "Strange to think how much time I spent here," she said, "waiting for someone who was never going to come." "Not strange. Human. You loved him and you had faith. There's no shame in that." "No, but there's waste in it. 5 years of my life organized around absence." She looked at Colton. "I won't do that again, even with you. I'll miss you during the weeks we're apart, but I won't stop living. I won't stand here watching horizons." "Good. I don't want you to wait for me. I want you to teach and read and build your programs and live fully. And when I come back on weekends, I want to hear about everything you did while I was gone." "Deal." She leaned into him. "How long do you think before we can live in the same place full time? 2 years, maybe less if the ranch does well. Once I've got the house built and enough cattle to sustain us, I can transition from foreman to running my own operation." He kissed the top of her head. "It's not ideal, but it's temporary. We just have to remember that." The weeks that followed their wedding established the pattern that would define the next year and a half of their marriage. Monday through Friday, Evelyn taught her students and managed the schoolhouse, while Colton worked at Blake's ranch, supervising crews and managing operations. Friday evenings, he'd ride the 40 miles to Red Willow, arriving dusty and tired, but always with a smile for his wife. They'd have the weekend together Saturday for errands and visiting with friends Sunday for rest and quiet time together before he rode back Monday morning. It was harder than Evelyn had anticipated. She'd told herself she could handle the separation, that she was independent enough not to need daily companionship. But she'd underestimated how much she'd miss the small intimacies of marriage, morning coffee together, evening conversations about the day, the simple presence of another person who knew and loved her. The letters helped. They wrote to each other almost daily, sharing details and thoughts and feelings. But letters weren't the same as presents, and more than once, Evelyn found herself lonely in ways she hadn't expected. 3 months into their marriage, she nearly broke. It was a Thursday evening, and something had gone wrong at school, a conflict between students that had escalated a parent who'd complained about her teaching methods, a moment of doubt about whether she was actually good at any of this. She'd come back to the boarding house exhausted and discouraged, wishing desperately that Colton was there to talk to lean on, to remind her why she did this work. Instead, she sat alone in her room and cried, letting the frustration and loneliness pour out until she was empty. Then she dried her face, pulled out paper, and wrote him a letter that was more honest than any she'd sent before. "I'm struggling. I knew the separation would be hard, but I didn't know it would be this hard. I miss you constantly. I miss having someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who understands me, someone who makes me feel less alone. I'm starting to wonder if we made a mistake trying to do marriage this way. I'm starting to wonder if I should just give up teaching and come to the ranch, even though that's not what we agreed to." She didn't send it immediately. Instead, she sat with it overnight, and in the morning, she added a postscript. "I wrote the above last night in a moment of weakness. I'm not going to cross it out because it's true. I do struggle. I do miss you. I do wonder sometimes if we should rethink our arrangement, but I also know that giving up teaching would make me resent you eventually, and I don't want that. So instead, I'm asking, can we find a middle ground? Can we figure out a way to make this more bearable for both of us?" His response came by special courier 3 days later. He'd paid extra to have it delivered rather than waiting for the regular mail. The letter was long and honest, and it made Evelyn cry again, but this time with relief rather than loneliness. "I struggle too. Every Monday morning when I leave you, I wonder if I'm being selfish, asking you to endure this separation so I can build my dream. Every night I come back to my quarters alone and wish you were there. I miss you so constantly it's become a physical ache. But here's what I know, giving up your teaching to make things easier in the short term would damage something essential about who you are. And I didn't marry you to change you. I married you because I love who you are, including your dedication to your students. So here's what I propose. I'm going to talk to Blake about adjusting my schedule. Instead of working straight through, what if I work 10 days on 4 days off? That gives me more concentrated time at the ranch, but also more time in Red Willow with you. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we have now. And Evelyn, thank you for being honest about struggling. Thank you for not pretending everything's fine when it's not. That's what partnership means, being real with each other, even when it's hard. Blake agreed to the new schedule without hesitation. "A man needs to be with his wife," he'd said gruffly. "Especially a new wife. We'll make it work." The adjusted arrangement helped significantly. 4 days together every couple of weeks was better than 2 days once a week, giving them time to actually settle into being married rather than constantly adjusting to being together and then apart. They developed rhythms during those longer visits, mornings, where Evelyn would work on school preparations while Colton handled ranch business. He could do remotely afternoons visiting with Lucas, and the Cheneys evenings, just being together. Winter came again, the second winter of their marriage. The sale of Blake's land was finalized in November, and Colton spent his time at the ranch clearing the site where they'd eventually build. He drew sketches of the proposed house, incorporating all of Evelyn's requirements, plus some ideas of his own: a wide porch for sitting in the evenings, a separate room that could serve as her study, a root cellar for storage. "When can we start building?" Evelyn asked, studying the sketches during one of his visits. "Spring, probably. Ground needs to thaw and I need to get more materials hauled in. But we could have the frame up by summer and be moving in by fall." He looked at her carefully. "That's when we'd need to make decisions about the teaching position." They'd been avoiding this conversation, but it couldn't be avoided forever. Once the house was built and they were living on their land full-time, Evelyn would have to choose continue teaching in Red Willow and maintain some kind of distance arrangement, or give up the position and find other ways to pursue her passion for education. "I've been thinking about that," Evelyn said slowly. "What if we started a small school on our property? Not a full schoolhouse, but maybe taking on a few students from neighboring ranches, teaching them a few days a week. It wouldn't be the same as what I do now, but it would let me continue teaching without requiring daily trips to Red Willow." Colton's face lit up. "That could work. There are several families in the area with school-aged children who are too far from town to attend regularly. You could provide them with education they wouldn't otherwise have access to. It would be different, smaller scale, less structured, but maybe that's all right. Maybe it's time for something new." "Only if it's what you want. I don't want you giving up something you love just because it's convenient." "I'm not. I'm adapting, which is different." She squeezed his hand. "I've learned that holding too tightly to one vision of how things should be can keep you from seeing other possibilities. Maybe this is a better possibility." Spring arrived with the usual drama of Wyoming weather, warm days, followed by surprise snowstorms, mud that made travel treacherous, winds that seemed determined to blow everything away. But it also brought new life, new growth, and the beginning of construction on their house. Colton hired a crew of 3 men to help with the heavy work, and Evelyn took time away from teaching to be there as much as possible. She wanted to see the foundation laid, wanted to watch the frame go up, wanted to be part of building this dream they shared. The house took shape slowly, beam by beam, board by board. By June, the frame was complete and the roof was on. By July, the walls were up, and the windows, including those east-facing ones Evelyn had requested, were installed. By August, it was nearly finished, needing only interior details and finishing touches. Evelyn gave her notice to the Red Willow School Board in September, effective at the end of the school year. It was harder than she expected, saying goodbye to the students she'd taught for years, to the school she'd built from almost nothing. But it also felt right, like she was completing one chapter so another could begin. Her students surprised her with a goodbye party the last week of classes, presenting her with a hand-drawn card signed by every child, and a beautiful quilt the mothers had made together, each square representing a different student or family. She cried openly, hugging each child and thanking them for letting her be part of their education. "You'll still be teaching, won't you?" Lucas asked. He was 10 now, reading at a level that would shame many adults confident and happy in ways that would have seemed impossible when she first met him. "Yes, just in a different way. And you'll come visit us at the ranch, won't you? We'll have a room ready just for you." "Every month," he promised. Mr. and Mrs. Cheney said so. The move to the ranch happened in October, exactly 2 years after Colton had first proposed. They didn't have much to move: Evelyn's books and personal belongings, some furniture gifted by Blake, and other friends the quilt from her students. But it was enough to make the house feel like home. The first morning in their new house, Evelyn woke before dawn and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The east-facing windows framed the sunrise, perfectly painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. She stood there with her hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the day break, and felt a peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. Colton's arms came around her from behind his chin, resting on her shoulder. Beautiful, isn't it? It's perfect. Everything is perfect. Not perfect, real, better than perfect. They stood together watching the sun rise over their land, over the life they'd built together through patience and honesty and hard work, and Evelyn knew he was right. Real was better than perfect. Real was what lasted. The small school Evelyn had envisioned became reality by the following spring. 3 families with a total of 7 children contracted with her to provide education 3 days a week. She set up a teaching room in the house, filled it with books and materials, and discovered that teaching fewer students more intensively was just as satisfying as managing a larger classroom. The children thrived under her attention, and their parents were grateful for the opportunity. Lucas visited regularly, often staying for weeks at a time during summer breaks. He'd grown into a thoughtful, capable young man who helped Colton with ranch work and discussed books with Evelyn in the evenings. Watching him flourish was one of the unexpected joys of their life together. Harrison Blake passed away in his sleep during the winter of their 3rd year on the ranch. He'd left instructions that Colton was to handle his affairs, and they discovered he'd forgiven the remaining debt on their land, giving them the property free and clear as a final gift. At his funeral, Evelyn had wept for the man who'd mentored her husband and helped make their dreams possible. "He said you were good for me," Colton told her afterward. "Said he could tell I was more settled, more focused after we married. He was right. You were good for me too, good for each other. That's how it's supposed to work." Years passed. The ranch grew slowly but steadily, building a reputation for well-bred cattle and fair dealing. Evelyn's informal school expanded to include children from 6 families, and she'd begun developing a curriculum she hoped to publish for other rural teachers. They'd added onto the house, creating more space for the life they were living and the future they were building toward. On a July afternoon, 5 years after their wedding, they stood together at the edge of their property, looking at a new addition, a fence post salvaged from red willow and transported with care to their land. It was the fence post weathered and worn, the one where Evelyn had spent so many evenings waiting, the one where she'd met Colton, the one that marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. They'd mounted a brass plaque on it, engraved with words Colton had chosen. For Evelyn, who waited with faith. For Colton, who found her. For the letters that led them home. "You're sure about this?" Colton asked. "I know it might bring up difficult memories." "It brings up all the memories, difficult and beautiful, that's the point." Evelyn ran her hand over the weathered wood one last time. "This post represents everything I went through to get here. The grief and the waiting and the wondering, but also the faith and the endurance and the eventual joy. I don't want to forget any of it." "No more waiting at fences," Colton said, echoing words from years ago. "No more waiting, no more unanswered letters, just 2 hearts facing the horizon together." She turned to look at their house at the barn and corrals Colton had built at the land stretching out around them. "Just this life we've built, this real, imperfect, beautiful life." He pulled her close, and they stood there in the Wyoming sunshine, looking at the fence post that had witnessed so much sorrow and ultimately led to so much joy. Behind them, the house waited with its east-facing windows and book-filled shelves and proper kitchen. Around them, the land stretched out in all its wild beauty. And ahead of them, the future spread like an open prairie, full of possibility, full of promise, full of whatever they chose to build together. That evening, as had become their custom, they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky. Evelyn had her lesson plan spread on her lap while Colton worked on ranch accounts, but mostly they just enjoyed being together, being present, being home. "Do you ever think about Miles?" Colton asked suddenly. It wasn't a question born of jealousy, but curiosity, and Evelyn appreciated the trust it represented. "Sometimes, less as time goes on, but sometimes." She set aside her papers. "I think about who I was when I loved him so young, so full of romantic notions about what life should be. I think about how grief shaped me, how waiting taught me things I needed to learn, even though I hated learning them. Do you think he'd be happy for you? For us?" "I think so. I think any man capable of real love would want the woman he loved to find happiness, even if he couldn't be the one to provide it." She reached for Colton's hand. He gave me this hunger for the West, this desire for something more authentic than Boston society. In a strange way, he set me on the path that led to you. Then I owe him thanks. We both do. His death taught me what I needed to know to recognize what was real when I finally found it. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. From inside the house came the sound of Lucas washing dishes he was visiting for the summer, and had taken on household chores with the same intensity he brought to everything. In the distance, they could hear cattle lowing and the wind moving through the prairie grass. "Happy?" Colton asked. Evelyn looked at her husband, at the life they'd built together through honesty and effort and love. She thought about the woman who'd stood by a fence post for 5 years, waiting for someone who would never come. She thought about the woman who'd grieved and endured and finally chosen to live instead of just survive. She thought about the woman she'd become through all of it, stronger, wiser, more herself than she'd ever been. "Happy," she confirmed, completely, thoroughly, gratefully happy. And it was true. She'd waited for years at a fence post, organizing her life around absence and hope. She'd grieved for a man she loved who'd died trying to build them a future. She'd learned the hard way that pretty promises weren't the same as lived reality. But she'd also learned that truth was worth more than romance, that partnership meant building together rather than one person following another, that love was daily choice and effort rather than grand gestures. She'd learned to stop waiting and start living, to stop watching horizons, and start creating her own landscape. The fence post stood on their property, now a monument not to loss but to transformation. A reminder that sometimes the hardest chapters of our lives are the ones that lead us to exactly where we need to be. That faith and grief can coexist, that endings make room for beginnings, that waiting eventually gives way to finding. As darkness fell completely and the stars blazed overhead in the vast Wyoming sky, Evelyn leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt the rightness of everything settle deep in her bones. This was it. This was the life she'd been moving toward all along, even when she didn't know it. This was home, not a place she'd been brought to by someone else's promises, but a place she'd built herself, board by board, choice by choice, day by day. No more letters going unanswered. No more standing alone by fence posts, just this love and land and partnership and possibility. Just Evelyn and Colton facing the horizon together, building a life as wide and open as the West itself. The end.